The flames of passion burn brightest when it comes to love.
I was really fond of her. She was a fun person.
But over time, even the hottest relationships can lose their spark.
They kept going back and forth in and out of relationships.
And when faced with a dwindling flame, you can become desperate.
I'm like, damn, she man crazy. If a man don't want to be bothered, he don't want to be bothered.
It just gets to her to the point where she can't stand it anymore and she decides to do something about it.
But sometimes, when you try to reignite that flame, it can cause irreparable damage.
The only thing going through her head at that moment was, I need to send him a message.
She was sad, she was mad, and she wanted his attention.
There was a billow of smoke coming from the house, and I seen two people in the middle of the street with sheets over.
Love can sometimes make you do very stupid things.
October 10th, 2015, Buffalo, New York. It's the middle of the night in the upstate city famous for its chilly weather and warm spirit.
Buffalo is, despite being the second largest city in the state, it's kind of a small world in and of itself. I feel like it lives up to its name too, being the city of good neighbors.
But just before dawn breaks on this Saturday morning, that motto is being put to the test.
About 4:30 in the morning, the Buffalo Fire Department erupts with 911 calls about a house fire on Curtis Street.
The house on Curtis Street was at a corner of the road, and it was a long house because about 13 people lived there.
Firefighters arrive to find the house fully engulfed.
There's blazes coming out of the windows in the upstairs.
Residents are running out of their homes, they're running out of the house that's on fire, of course. Everyone's sort of standing around.
And at this time of morning, they know there may be several people still sleeping inside.
As soon as the firefighters get to scene, they immediately start questioning people while others go inside to try to rescue the residents.
It was a boarding house, 14 rooms, and it had a bar downstairs and then rooms in the back.
Doing a room-by-room search, firefighters help as many residents escape as possible until the flames force them out of the building.
Unfortunately, after a while, the house just became engulfed in smoke to the point where the air quality was impossible to breathe in.
It takes a period of time to get those flames under control.
After the firefighters knock the fire down, they head back inside.
In the thick smoke, they resume their search, where they realize not everyone made it out of the house.
In the upstairs hallway, they find two people by the back door. Neither person is moving. It looked like they were trying to escape through a rear door.
In the poor visibility, the firefighters can't tell if either person is alive, but they do note a nearby wheelchair before pulling both of them out of the building.
Once outside, they see it's two men. They try to render aid, but it's too late. They were unfortunately deceased.
Neighbors outside are able to identify both men. They are 64-year-old James Hodges and 58-year-old Edward Hughes.
Everybody else got out, but them two didn't get out. And it just happened to be my brother Edward and James Hodges.
Edward Hughes was born and raised in upstate New York with a large and tight-knit family.
My mother had 7 kids, so we all was born and raised here.
Edward Hughes was in the Navy and came back to Buffalo after his service.
Although Edward remained single, his home was always the epicenter of the neighborhood for friends and family.
We just be over there laughing and giggling. We used to have a lot of good times. He just liked to joke all the time.
Mr. Hughes was a fun person, a very fun person. He'd have you laughing for days. He was like a brother to me.
Edward was also known as a hard worker, making a living in local factories. until an accident on the job critically injured his back.
He had a slip disc, and that took him from working, so he went on disability. He had to go through rehabilitation and everything for it.
He had recently had spinal surgery and used a wheelchair.
He was in a wheelchair, different things, but see, Edward wasn't wheelchair bound. He can get up and walk, but that's what he preferred to do.
In 2013, when Edward moved into the house on Curtis Street, he had no problem settling into his upstairs apartment, where he quickly made a new friend, James Hodges.
Edward and James, they was like right next door to each other. And, you know, they're in the rooming house. Always in the hallway or downstairs outside talking and laughing, doing what they do.
64-year-old James Hodges was also a proud Buffalo resident.
James Hodges was a well-known and respected member of his community.
Mr. Hodges knew a lot of history about Buffalo. And, I mean, we learned a lot from him as well.
I came to the building quite a bit to sit up there with them, and, you know, they'd be up in the hallway playing music. We always play our oldies.
And the evening of October 9th started like any other, with James and Edward hanging out in their usual spots before retiring to bed with plans for Saturday chores.
I spoke with Edward. I said, well, Edward, I'll be over there in the morning, pick up your clothes to go wash.
But the deadly fire that erupted at 4:30 a.m. abruptly ended those plans and the lives of both men.
Edward Hughes and James Hodges' final moments had to be really scary. I'm sure their body and their minds were in survival mode of trying to figure out how to save their own lives.
After clearing the rest of the house, firefighters call in the Buffalo Fire Marshal, whose first job is finding out what caused this fire.
They're just trying to gather as much information as possible to determine when the fire started and how. There's a crowd of people gathered at the scene, and the fire marshal wants to speak to everyone.
On the morning of October 10th, 2015, loved ones of Edward Hughes and James Hodges have just learned that the two beloved men did not survive a mysterious boarding house fire.
Somebody called me and told me, said, Imogene, is you sitting down? He said, Edward dead. I said, what you mean he dead? And he said, it was a fire. And I said, oh my gosh, because I was supposed to be going over there. But by the time we got over there, that building was burnt up, down to the ground.
Now, the Buffalo Fire Marshal has been called to the scene to investigate the cause of the deadly blaze.
The marshal's first job is talking to witnesses on the scene to see who noticed the flames first.
Because the fire happened at 4:30 in the morning, residents all say they were asleep.
They tell the fire marshals they woke up to the sound of the fire alarms blaring. The residents say their rooms flooded with smoke quickly.
They said Edward was asleep, but they said they had banged on the door for him and James to get up.
As investigators work diligently to get all of the witness statements, a neighbor approaches.
The fire marshals are talking to the bystanders. They come across a woman who says that her name is Al-Sharifa Robinson.
Al-Sharifa explains that she was home asleep that night when her daughter woke her up to tell her about the house down the street.
She's awoken by her daughter that the house is on fire. There are flames coming out of the windows and the door.
But what immediately gets the attention of investigators? The woman says she is well acquainted with the landlord.
Her on-again, off-again boyfriend runs the rooming house, and he also lives there. She says his name is Derek Williams.
Al-Sharifa Robinson hailed from Buffalo and was the proud matriarch of a large and loving family.
She has 2 daughters and 2 sons, just like I did, and 3 grandchildren.
Al-Sharifa was also especially close with her mother.
She was my best friend. I think people, when they hear me talk about her, they think, oh, you're biased. If this wasn't my daughter, I'd say the same thing.
Al-Sharifa is described as having a solid work ethic. She's worked ever since she was 14.
And when she graduated, she got employment with the bank here in Buffalo.
But she did not have the same success when it came to romance.
My daughter was beautiful, had a nice shape, a good job. Men took advantage of her. They saw the good in her, and it seems like she gravitated towards the ones that were misfits.
But that luck seemed to change when Al-Sharifa met a kindred spirit from the neighborhood, a man named Derek Williams.
Al-Sharifa and I met like in 2008. I was really fond of her. She was a fun person, and we got along real good.
Derek was immediately attracted to Al-Sharifa's kind, magnetic spirit.
She was a sweetheart. She was a fun person, always happy, laughing. She was proud of her job, her kids. She was just a fun person to be around.
After 4 years of dating, it seemed Al-Sharifa had finally found a perfect match.
It was good for some years, and like any other relationship, things just started downsizing. Sharifa, she accused me of seeing other women, and I was seeing other women.
For a while, Al-Sharifa gave Derek a pass.
They still kept going back and forth, in and out of relationships, while he was having relationships with other women. She hates to give up on anything. She was determined, I'm gonna change this person.
And then one day, she gave me an ultimatum. She was like, you and your little side girls, if you don't commit, our relationship gonna be done. And that's what happened. The relationship ended between me and Al-Sharifa.
While the couple had seemingly split for good, Derek didn't go far. He began managing a boarding house on the same street.
He had a rooming house at the corner, maybe 3-4 doors from her.
Derek Williams' nephew was the owner, but he was the manager of it, and he lived there.
But where is Derek now? Al-Sharifa tells the fire marshal she hasn't been able to get in touch with her ex.
Al-Sharifa had tried calling Derek, but he was not answering.
But soon after investigators wrap their interview with Al-Sharifa, Derek arrives on scene. He says he woke up to several missed calls and messages about the fire.
I jumped in my car and I just flew to my house, and there was a lot of people out, and there was a billow of smoke coming from the house.
That's when Derek learns that not all of the tenants made it out alive.
I seen 2 people in the middle of the street with sheets over. Once I found out who it was, I was really devastated.
To investigators, Derek seems genuinely distraught. But they suspect he knows more. And what he says next confirms the hunch.
That evening around 10:30, he was at the boarding house where he lives and where he works, and he's actually with the 2 gentlemen.
Some kind of way I felt responsible.
It was a well-known case at the time. People didn't know, well, was this an arson case for insurance, or what could the cause have possibly been? It was a really big case for the city of Buffalo because this was something that you didn't hear about happening here often, not this type of thing. There were neighbors who witnessed the house go up in flames that night, knowing there were people inside, and they'll forever be traumatized by that. And it really sends a ripple effect throughout the entire community.
Fire investigators in Buffalo, New York have just interviewed Al-Sharifa Robinson, a woman whose ex-boyfriend manages the rooming house where 2 men have died in a fire.
The fire marshal believes Al-Sharifa might have more information about the occupants of the home, so he tells her he'd like to talk to her again later.
And now, they've turned their attention to Al-Sharifa's ex and the rooming house landlord, Derek Williams, who's just arrived to the chaotic scene.
A good 10-house radius, it was just fire trucks on both sides.
But Derek is even more devastated to learn that his tenants, Edward Hughes and James Hodges, did not survive.
That's when the mental part of me kicked in. You know, just thinking about these guys just retired and they didn't get a chance to enjoy their retirement life. And some kind of way I felt responsible.
Derek explains that he had not been home when the fire erupted. But the evening beforehand, he had stopped by to visit both gentlemen, specifically about the building's smoke detectors.
The only problem me and Mr. Hughes had was we were getting arguments about him taking his smoke detector off the wall. He'd take the batteries out and then he put it in his drawer. And we arguing. I'm like, you can't do that.
Edward, he said the fire alarm in the hallway sometimes the battery kept going out or something.
Mr. Hodges did the same thing with the smoke detector. He'd take it off the wall, take the batteries out, and throw it in his drawer. He just, I don't know, it was just something about smoke detectors that I guess it was the noise.
Was Derek's timely warning about the smoke alarms a sad coincidence? He claims he's just as perplexed as the other tenants as to how the fire started.
I actually didn't know. I had no clue. I felt bad for everybody, including myself. I felt bad for the 2 deceased. I felt bad for my loss. I felt bad for their loss. I felt bad for everything that took place.
As with Al-Sharifa, investigators plan on following up with Derek.
The marshal and another gentleman gave me cards and said that they'll be in contact with me.
As day breaks, the fire marshal turns back to the building itself for any clues that could determine the fire's source.
After the fire marshal interviews everyone at the scene, he turns his attention to the home.
The building was still standing. It was burnt up. It was so badly burnt inside. You could see all through it.
They start the meticulous process upstairs, where the 2 victims had been trapped.
Their bodies were found. They were just shy of the exit, as they had almost made it. And they are able to determine the origin point of the fire is on the right side of the building.
The next step is to determine the cause.
It's a process of elimination to determine that a fire was set by human hands. They have to be able to effectively rule out the other possible causes of fire.
They check for any signs of electrical or mechanical malfunction.
Electrical, there's an electrical wire near the origin of the fire. There isn't. And mechanical, is there a heater or a toaster or something that could have caused the fire? No.
More and more, it's looking like this fire was started intentionally.
When they're able to rule all those things out, the only thing we're left with is a human started this fire.
With no signs of a source inside the home, investigators move outside.
On the 4th wall, which was the right-facing wall, they found very obvious fire damage. The fire damage goes right up to the top where people were living.
Meaning someone on the outside started the fire. But how?
They then take a sample of debris from that area and have it tested. They find there's ignitable liquid vapors in that debris, which makes them all the more certain that someone started this fire.
Which means this investigation has now taken an entirely new turn.
Homicide is called in immediately.
Investigators with the Buffalo Fire Department have just determined that a fatal blaze at a boarding house was intentionally set.
The fire marshal determines that an arsonist started this fire. He alerts a homicide detective at the Buffalo Police Department.
the DA office called and said it was a homicide. I said, a homicide? How the hell is it a homicide? What the hell went on?
Unfortunately, despite their diligent efforts questioning witnesses at the scene, investigators are not able to answer that question.
They take statements from Derek Williams, they take statements from other witnesses, but there's no person of interest who started this fire.
Detectives hope to get more information from the autopsy.
The autopsies for Edward Hughes and James Hodges come back and determine that both of the men died of carbon dioxide intoxication.
Notably, there was black charcoal around their nostrils and in their mouth.
Confirming the fire was not set in an attempt to cover up any other cause of death. The two men had clearly died trying to escape.
When everybody else went down the stairs, those two individuals that died from smoke inhalation in that rooming house were upstairs on the second floor, trying to get out of a metal door.
But why had the fire been set in the first place? Homicide investigators circle back to witnesses from the scene.
The fire marshal works with the homicide detective, and together they start the long process of interviewing everyone who lives at the boarding house.
The police began their investigation with Derek Williams.
At the police station, Derek reiterates that he wasn't home at the time of the fire.
I was invited to a dinner at a lady friends of mine.
Derek goes on to explain that he'd recently re-entered the dating scene.
He had been in a relationship with El Sharif for about 4 years. They had broken it off. And from his statement, he's just kind of enjoying being single for a little while.
Derek says that after visiting with his tenants Edward Hughes and James Hodges that night, he headed out for his date.
He leaves them to go see his new girlfriend or a girl that he is seeing, and he ends up staying over with that woman. He says he meant to return home, but he didn't. He fell asleep at that woman's house.
That morning, Derek says he'd woken up to several missed calls, informing him of the unthinkable.
My lady friend woke me up again, and she said, your house is on fire. So I ran over there. I started asking questions about the other guys that lived there. And then they told me there was 2 guys in the street that was deceased.
Derek says he can't think of any reason someone would light the house on fire.
Derek tells police he has no idea who's behind the arson.
And a call to Derek's date corroborates his whereabouts at the time of the fire.
From what we could tell, he's not being dishonest. He's with another woman that evening.
Satisfied with Derek's statement for now, investigators move on to other witnesses.
It takes several weeks to interview everyone who lived in or near the home to rule out potential suspects.
A task that proves difficult, since surviving tenants have been displaced from their home.
They went around the neighborhood putting notes on people's doors. Please come talk to us. There was this fire. You live in the area. You may know something.
It's a tactic that pays off when one witness comes forward with a key piece of information.
They questioned the person that lived next door. He said he saw somebody carrying a bag.
The neighbor says he didn't get a good look, but believes it was a woman and remembers seeing her well after midnight.
He was like, I was in my car, and I seen her walking down the street with something in her hand.
It's not much to go on, but every bit of information helps. Meanwhile, investigators also turn to the victims' families for any potential clues.
They're trying to figure out if anyone had a beef with someone in the building that would lead them to the suspect.
When they speak with Edward's sister, Imogene, about the last time she spoke with her brother, she admits something does stand out about that night.
That night, I spoke with Edward. He had called me, and he said some girl keep coming down there, banging on the door, and he said, I wish she stopped coming down there. And I said, well, what is she done talking about? She keep coming down there looking for his landlord.
Imogene didn't think anything of it at the time. and the conversation moved from neighborhood drama to planning Saturday morning chores.
I didn't know who he was talking about. So I said, oh, Albert, I'll be over there in the morning. Tomorrow came, and he dead. My brother Albert dead.
Now, detectives want to know, who was the woman demanding to see Derek that night? Before they have a chance to answer that question, investigators get a call back from a neighbor who received one of their notes. Derek's ex, Al Sharifa.
So on January 25th, Al Sharifa, sees the note on her door. She comes in of her own volition. She sits down. She's talking with them.
The fire marshal immediately recognizes Al Sharifa from their conversation the night of the fire.
He remembers she said she was the girlfriend of Derek Williams.
It's a casual conversation, and the fire marshals ask her a series of questions about the fire. It's the same questions they've asked every other witness that has come in to talk to them.
Al Sharifa reiterates that she was home the night of the fire, but investigators press her further.
They ask the question, did you start the fire? That was just a standard question.
But Al Sharifa's answer shocks everyone in the room.
She says yes. And they are just blown away. They did not expect that admission.
January 2016. Investigators in Buffalo, New York were questioning 40-year-old Al Sharifa Robinson about a deadly fire when she made a surprising confession.
When they get to the question, did you start this fire? She says yes. And they were shocked. So when that happens, of course, now she's made herself a suspect. They read her rights, they Mirandize her, but she waives her right to remain silent. She waives her right to an attorney, and she does, and she tells them everything that happened that night.
Al Sharifa explains that she and Derek had a tumultuous relationship.
She was in a relationship with this man, Mr. Williams, for about 4 years, and they had broken the relationship off.
Although the relationship was over, Al Sharifa and Derek stayed in each other's lives.
But Al Sharifa says she was having second thoughts about the breakup.
Al Sharifa wanted to rekindle the relationship with Derek.
She thought that she can come back to me, but I've been single all that time. I'm enjoying myself, doing what I want.
But Al Sharifa says Derek was sending her mixed messages, and living in the same neighborhood made things even more complicated.
He lived 3 houses away so he could see her every day, coming and going. If any car was parked in front of her house, he would come running over there. Who is that? Whose car is that?
Likewise, witnessing Derek's new love life was taking a toll on Al Sharifa, especially when a new woman came into the picture.
She was feeling not just ignored, but neglected. And then you add this new woman in her boyfriend's life. She was infuriated.
Al Sharifa says by October, tensions between the on and off again lovers had reached an all-time high. So on the night of the 9th, she decided to let off some steam with her girlfriends.
A couple of her friends had gotten together. They went out, they had a great time. She came back because evidently Derek had told her earlier that he was going to come over.
While out with her friends, Al Sharifa says she'd tried getting a hold of Derek to confirm their plans.
She got home at 1 a.m. and tried to reach him again, but still no answer.
Al Sharifa says she walked over to Derek's boarding house, but despite her loud knocks, no one answered.
Derek Williams is either not responding or not responding the way that Al Sharifa wants him to. So she's getting angrier and angrier as the night goes on.
Al Sharifa explains that after years of mixed messages, she had finally reached a boiling point.
That night, it just gets to her to the point where she can't stand it anymore. She decides that she's going to get his attention, and she decides the way that she's going to do that is to set fire to his house.
Al Sharifa says she walked back to her house and methodically packed a bag of supplies.
She puts cooking oil, bug spray, lighter fluid, and a lighter in that bag.
She said she wanted to start a fire on the side of the house just to char it and make Derek mad.
But she says that wasn't as easy as she thought.
She pours the fluid that she brought with her. She tries to start the fire. She tries once. It doesn't take, it doesn't light. She tries again, it doesn't work. So at that point, she decides to walk to the closest gas station and purchase motor oil.
Using the motor oil, Al-Sharifa says she was finally able to start the fire.
She said, I just poured something in the waste paper basket that's on the side of the house. I threw a match in it.
That time she is successful. The fire is lit. She sees that she's successful, it goes up. So she goes home and she goes to bed.
Satisfied that the small fire she started would finally get Derek's attention, Al-Sharifa says she finally went to sleep. But at around 4:30 a.m., her daughter woke her in a panic.
Her daughter wakes her up a few hours later, saying that there's a house on fire.
Al-Sharifa said she quickly made her way back over to the boarding house.
On her way, Al-Sharifa says she tried calling Derek again, but her calls continued to go to voicemail. Moments later, she arrives at the boarding house just in time to witness the horror.
She goes to the scene and she's interviewed. That's one of the reasons the fire marshals put a note on her doors. She's there and around the scene that night. She talks to Derek that night. She talks to family members of the victims that night.
But now, Al-Sharifa says she feels horrible. She never intended to hurt anyone, let alone kill two innocent men.
Al-Sharifa just wanted to get Derek's attention, and it unfortunately had long-term consequences.
Al-Sharifa was remorseful. She knew those two gentlemen. She knew the pain that it caused Derek Williams. She knew the pain that it caused the family. She had a moment of bad judgment, and she felt bad.
Despite her remorse, detectives arrest Al-Sharifa immediately.
She's charged with 2 counts of murder in the second degree. She's also charged with arson in the second degree. So arson in the second degree is when you intentionally set fire to a building, knowing, or reasonably you should know, that there is occupants inside of it.
As the mother of 4 is placed behind bars, word spreads across Buffalo, and everyone who knows Al-Sharifa is shocked.
They called me from the fire station where they had interrogated her and gotten a confession. My whole world turned upside down. Her children, they didn't know what to do. They still don't know what to do.
I actually thought that they had the wrong person. I just couldn't see her doing it.
But for the victim's family, the arrest unleashes an entirely new set of emotions when the senselessness of the crime sets in.
So I was very angry because Derek wasn't even there. She know he wasn't there. She just man crazy. You know, if a man don't want to be bothered, he don't want to be bothered. Let it go. To burn some house with all these peoples in there, that was the worst mistake she ever made.
At the end of November 2016, just over a year from the deadly fire, the trial gets underway in a packed courtroom.
It had to have been over 20 peoples on her family side come.
I went every day. My mother went every day. My sister, sitting in that courtroom.
Could community support for Al-Sharifa sway the jury in her favor?
In this case, we had 2 dead men, and so being remorseful can only excuse so much.
If a person thinks that cheating is normal, but they also think of it as like a negative thing within their relationship, it can affect their self-esteem, their self-worth. So when that happens, that can cause somebody to have a intense emotional reaction. If you're not thinking clearly through your decisions, then it can result in consequences. And in this case, consequences that you cannot come back from or change.
November 2016. In Buffalo, New York, 41-year-old Al-Sharifa Robinson is standing trial for setting a fire that killed 2 men. And the prosecution is quick to point out that they only need to prove Al-Sharifa intended to start the fire.
I have to prove intent as far as the arson is concerned, and legally speaking, we have to show a logical nexus between the arson and the death.
She knew what she was doing. That's why she was so quick to admit it to the fire marshal.
Not only that, Al-Sharifa went to great lengths to make sure the fire was lit.
What's interesting is a lot of times these bad decisions that you see people make, they happen in an instant. And that's not what happened here. She tries very, very hard again and again to achieve her objective, which is to set the house on fire.
But what about Derek's side of the story? In an effort to provide more context to the toxic relationship, the prosecution calls him to the stand.
Giving them that background can be very helpful. And certainly, Derek Williams is a major player in this case.
But in an odd twist, Derek chooses not to cooperate.
The moment he takes the stand, my colleague asks our first question, and he says, "I claim the fifth," which typically is the right against self-incrimination. In this case, we had no reason to believe that he did anything incriminating, so our questioning of him was done.
I just didn't want to be a part of it, and I'm saying to myself, anything happen to me, what is this court going to do to protect me? And that's when I decided not to get involved in it.
He didn't want to be a participant in her prosecution. I think really what he was doing is he just did not want to testify against Al-Sharifa. I think he felt sad, he felt bad, when it was obvious that he was simply trying to not hurt her any further.
Al-Sharifa also opts out of testifying. Instead, the defense leans on her prior statement that she'd acted in a crime of passion after being driven to the edge by a disloyal man.
It seemed that she was in a relationship that was toxic, and it caused her to have a lot of emotions that were just so intense that it resulted in harmful behavior.
On December 1st, 2016, the jury retires to decide Al-Sharifa's fate.
I was confident that we had met every element of the crimes with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And the judge instructs the jury, you cannot consider sympathy. You can't take that into account. But of course, we're all human.
The trial lasted 4 days. They deliberated for less time than it took me to go and get something to eat and come back.
They find Al-Sharifa guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of arson.
She was sad. She was not surprised, but she was sad.
On December 23rd, she is sentenced to 15 years to life.
The judge gave her a sentence on the low end. So she gave 15 to life for each of the murder charges and 5 years determinate for the arson.
The sentence that she received, I think, was more than fair, because I'm a firm believer that it doesn't take a lifetime to learn a lesson.
So I know she's sitting there thinking about what she did, but that's not going to bring my brother back. But he had peace. He had peace now. But I still play all the old music. When I plays it, I thinks about him a lot.
While Al-Sharifa serves her time, her mom faithfully stands by her side, and both women have become outspoken advocates for incarcerated women.
When she went into Bedford Hills, she said, "Mommy, there's a lot of women down here that don't have anybody to do anything for them, no visits or anything. You don't have to do so much for me, but you can try and help some of them." So I did whatever I could for her and about 8 or 9 other, I call them bonus daughters and bonus sisters. I didn't Google them to see what crime. That didn't matter to me. I want to look at who you are now, because we all change.
Even behind bars, Al-Sharifa finds peace in sharing her story, in hopes it could help someone get out of a similar situation before it's too late.
I think this situation with Al-Sharifa really shows you how Your decisions don't only impact you as an individual, but it could impact your family and your loved ones and the people around you.
The prospect of losing love ignites a dark fear in all of us. Sometimes we lose sight of everything, even ourselves. And one desperate strike could lead to damage beyond repair.
The heavy rain hammered against the roof of the old farmhouse in the outskirts of Oakhaven, a sound that, for 20 years, local detectives would remember as the soundtrack to the most baffling night in the town's history. It was November 14th, 2005, a date now etched in the darkest annals of criminal records, when the silence of the night was shattered by a single, desperate 911 call that led to nothing but a vacuum of evidence. The line went dead before the dispatcher could even pin down a location, and when the authorities arrived, all they found was an open door, a cooling cup of coffee on the kitchen table, and a hallway that held the distinct, metallic scent of ozone and something far more sinister. There were no fingerprints, no forced entry, and no witnesses. Just an inexplicable void where a human life had been only minutes before. This was the birth of a cold case that would haunt the community like a ghost, a mystery that defied logic and twisted the nerves of every investigator assigned to the file. Year after year, the file grew thicker, accumulating dust and failed leads, while the public's memory of the victim began to blur into the background of a town trying to move on. Yet, in the shadows of the evidence locker, the case was never truly dead. It was merely waiting, a dormant predator in the archives of justice. The atmosphere in Oakhaven remained thick with an unspoken dread, a persistent, low-frequency hum of anxiety that surfaced whenever a stranger rolled through town or a new, unexplained disappearance hit the regional news. The victim, a quiet librarian named Sarah, had left behind a life of order and simplicity that had been violently disrupted, leaving behind only questions that seemed to multiply with every passing season. Detectives chased shadows in the dark, interviewing the same neighbors, reviewing the same grainy surveillance footage from a gas station 3 miles away, and walking the same perimeter of the woods that had swallowed the truth whole. The frustration was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that forced seasoned officers into early retirement and fueled the desperate obsession of those who stayed behind. They called it the Ghost of Oakhaven, a cold case that became the yardstick by which all other investigations were measured, a dark monument to the limitations of forensic science in the early 2000s. The community felt the ripple effect of this trauma daily, a collective holding of breath that lasted for over a decade, as the case moved from the front pages of the local press to the yellowing boxes of the basement storage. But as technology accelerated, as the cold case unit began to deploy experimental forensic profiling and mass-scale genetic genealogy, the walls of silence began to crack. It wasn't a sudden explosion of truth, but a slow, agonizing erosion of the suspect's carefully constructed invisibility. The digital footprint, once non-existent, began to emerge from the wreckage of forgotten server logs and cold call databases. Police started finding threads, insignificant at first, a stray contact in an old address book, a vehicle registration that didn't quite align with the timeline, that slowly began to weave a tapestry of guilt. The shift was seismic when the lab results returned, linking the microscopic debris found on the kitchen table to a serial offender operating in a completely different jurisdiction, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the department and turned the long-dormant investigation into a high-stakes manhunt. Once again, cold case was white-hot, the energy in the precinct shifting from the lethargy of defeat to the frantic, blood-pumping adrenaline of the hunt. Every officer knew the stakes. This wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about reclaiming the peace of a town that had been under a decades-long siege of uncertainty. The manhunt moved with a surgical, terrifying precision, cutting through the red tape of multi-state cooperation, fueled by the singular, burning need for closure that had kept this file at the top of the stack for 10 agonizing years. The air in the briefing room was thick, not just with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights, but with the palpable, jagged tension of a decade-old debt finally coming due. Detectives stared at the evidence board, a chaotic mosaic of grainy crime scene photos and annotated timelines that had been their primary reality for over 10 years, now suddenly transformed by a single, clinical laboratory report. The DNA profile, once an orphan in the system, had found its twin. It wasn't just a match. It was a revelation that bridged the chasm between Oak Haven's forgotten tragedy and a string of unsolved nightmares spanning 3 states. The suspect was no longer a phantom. He had a name, a history, and a pattern of movement that turned the map of the region into a roadmap of terror. "Look at the trajectory," lead Detective Miller barked, his finger trembling slightly as he traced a line across the state map. He wasn't just passing through. He was hunting. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The 2005 case wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a calibrated exercise in cruelty. For years, the department had chased the illusion of a local perpetrator, someone with a grudge or a secret, but the reality was far more clinical and infinitely more terrifying. They were dealing with a serial offender, an individual who treated human lives like disposable variables in a dark equation of his own making. Every piece of evidence that had been discarded, every lead that had gone cold, was suddenly recontextualized. The broken window latch that was initially dismissed as a faulty mechanical failure, now it was a diagnostic signature of a man who specialized in bypassing security with the ease of a master locksmith. The lack of struggle in the kitchen? Not a sign of a voluntary departure, but a terrifying hallmark of someone who commanded absolute terror, who silenced his victims before they could even draw a breath. The investigation, once a stagnant pool, became a rushing torrent. Every available resource was diverted into the deep dive analysis of the suspect's life. They pulled his financial records, his employment history, and every digital footprint he had left in the wake of his movements. It was a digital archaeology project of the most grisly sort. They found that he had been working as a long-haul truck driver during the period of the Oak Haven disappearance, a job that provided the perfect camouflage for a predator operating across state lines. His logs were pristine, a masterclass in obfuscation, yet beneath the surface, the dates aligned with the spikes in regional violence. It was all there. The fuel stops near crime scenes, the phone pings in rural zones hours away from his assigned routes, the strange, erratic gaps in his travel. "We were looking for a man with a motive," the younger officer whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "We should have been looking for a man with a schedule." The truth of the matter was cold, hard, and unforgiving. The suspect wasn't driven by passion. He was driven by a cold, systematic compulsion. He was an apex predator who had leveraged the anonymity of the highway system to build a legacy of silence. As the team delved deeper, they unearthed a disturbing reality. The suspect had been hiding in plain sight for the better part of 2 decades, a chameleon who had integrated into the fabric of everyday life while maintaining his own secret, nocturnal ecosystem. He had attended community events, had been a regular at small-town diners, and had even, in one instance, assisted an elderly neighbor with a flat tire, all while the police were scouring the woods for a killer they thought was a monster living under their floorboards. The irony was as suffocating as it was cruel. The community had been looking for a neighbor who had gone rogue, an internal rot, never suspecting that the rot was a traveler who had simply marked their town on a checklist. The sheer scale of the deception began to unravel as the team cross-referenced the Oak Haven evidence with the new, emerging data. They found hair samples in the suspect's recovered vehicle that matched the forensic profile of the victim, a piece of evidence so definitive it effectively turned the tide of the entire decade-old investigation. The room went silent as the lab technician read the results aloud. There was no cheering, no high-fiving, just a heavy, mournful understanding of the horror they were uncovering. Every minute spent in the past was now being paid for with the currency of hard evidence. The press would call it a breakthrough, a triumph of modern science over the darkness of the past, but for those in the room, it felt like pulling teeth from a giant. They were reconstructing a decade of violence, one piece at a time. The victim's family, who had lived through 10 years of agonizing silence, were now on the precipice of a truth that promised both closure and a new, different kind of pain. The investigators prepared to notify them, Knowing that the cold case label was about to be peeled away to reveal the raw, exposed nerves of a tragedy that had never truly stopped bleeding. The suspect, currently residing in a state facility on an unrelated charge of larceny, had no idea that the walls were closing in. He had assumed his anonymity was bulletproof, that the distance between his crimes had created a barrier that no amount of detective work could ever breach. He was wrong. The digital age had finally caught up to his analog sins. Every phone record, every credit card transaction, and every bit of DNA evidence had been waiting, patiently, for the tools to connect them. The cold case wasn't just solved, it was being disassembled, its dark components laid bare under the bright, sterile lights of the forensic lab. Outside, the town of Oakhaven continued to exist in its bubble of perceived safety, oblivious to the fact that their darkest nightmare was being systematically dismantled in a room down the street. The rain continued to fall, as it had for 10 years, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a shroud. It felt like a cleansing, a washing away of the uncertainty that had stifled the town's progress. The detectives pushed forward, fueled by a relentless, grinding momentum that took no prisoners and left no stone unturned. They were the architects of a new reality, one where the truth, however ugly, was finally allowed to breathe. The hunt had transformed from a frantic scramble into a surgical extraction, a methodical stripping away of the lies that had protected a monster for far too long. As they prepared for the next phase, the notification of the family and the eventual confrontation with the suspect, the weight of the moment settled over them. This wasn't just about the Oakhaven case anymore. It was about the dozens of other families across the country who were still waiting for that same phone call, still living in the shadow of their own unanswered mysteries. They were the pioneers of a new way of doing justice, proving that time was no longer a shield for those who preyed on the vulnerable. The cold case was a fossil, and they were the geologists, carefully brushing away the dirt of years to reveal the predator beneath. And as the night wore on, the sense of inevitable justice grew, a quiet, steady thrumming in the hearts of every investigator, signaling that the end of the chase was not just near, it was certain. The darkness that had descended on the farmhouse in 2005 was finally receding, chased away by the persistent, unyielding light of truth. The gravity of the impending arrest settled over the investigation unit like a physical shroud, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to draw the oxygen out of the room. Every member of the task force understood that the moment they moved on the suspect, now identified, cataloged, and pinned to the Oakhaven scene through a mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence, the dormant mystery would erupt into a public firestorm. They were no longer investigators chasing whispers. They were about to become the architects of a headline that would tear the bandages off a decade-old wound. The suspect, currently incarcerated in a neighboring state's correctional facility for a series of minor, opportunistic thefts, remained entirely unaware that his shadow life was being exposed. He was a creature of calculated habits, a man who believed he had outrun the consequences of his actions by simply fading into the gray, anonymous noise of a transient existence. He had no idea that while he had been marking time in a holding cell, a dedicated team of detectives had been meticulously building a digital and biological bridge between his current confinement and the farmhouse where a librarian's life had been extinguished. "We have to be surgical," Detective Miller reminded the room, his eyes bloodshot from 3 consecutive nights of reviewing the suspect's trail. "He's a cornered animal, and he's lived on the edge for 20 years. If he catches wind of what we're doing, he won't just run. He'll vanish into the black holes of the highway system." The strategy was clear. The arrest had to be orchestrated with the precision of a military strike. They weren't just picking up a thief. They were serving a warrant for a haunting legacy of violence. The coordination required to transport a suspect, secure a high-profile interrogation suite, and ensure that every piece of evidence remained chain of custody perfect was a nightmare of bureaucratic and tactical planning. Yet, through the haze of exhaustion, there was a strange, grim exhilaration. The cold case was no longer a ghost. It was a flesh-and-blood man sitting in a cell only 200 miles away. The team began the process of hardening the case. They revisited every witness, those who had aged, those who had moved on, and those who had lost hope. They had to be prepared for the psychological toll of re-interviewing these individuals. To many, the mention of Sarah's name was still synonymous with the night the town lost its innocence. They had to tread carefully, balancing the need for finality against the trauma of opening doors that had been locked for a decade. The interviews were intense, often devolving into quiet, tearful exchanges that underscored the human cost of the delay. Each witness offered a fragment of the past, a sighting of a strange truck, a recollection of a flickering porch light, a moment of unexplained dread that, when laid against the current findings, clicked into place with terrifying clarity. It was as if the town itself was finally speaking, shedding the silence it had worn like a heavy, uncomfortable garment. As the days crawled toward the 0 hour, the atmosphere inside the department became electric. The silence was gone, replaced by the frenetic activity of a machine that had finally found its gear. They were drafting the affidavit, a document that would detail the chilling progression of a serial predator who had used the freedom of the roads to cultivate a harvest of victims. The document was a masterclass in forensic reconstruction, detailing the intersection of DNA evidence, GPS data from the suspect's past employment, and the terrifyingly specific MO that had bridged the gap between states. They were building a narrative of control, showing how he had watched, how he had waited, and how he had struck with a clinical coldness that defied human empathy. The emotional stakes were hammered home when the lead detective visited the victim's parents. The house was exactly as it had been 10 years ago, the same photos on the mantel, the same scent of lavender and old paper, as if time had refused to pass for them. When he delivered the news, the reaction wasn't the relief he had anticipated. It was a profound, seismic shift that left the room reeling. There was no joy in the revelation, only a cold, hard ache. The mystery had been a part of their lives, a constant, nagging presence, and now that it was being solved, they were forced to face the finality of their daughter's absence. The detective sat with them for hours, not as a representative of the law, but as a witness to their grief. It served as a stark reminder that the cold case label was, in truth, a cruel euphemism for a suffering that never actually grew cold. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the digital forensic team was pulling the final threads of the suspect's timeline. They had managed to recover data from an old, discarded hard drive they found in a storage unit associated with the suspect's alias. It contained a cache of images, not of his crimes, but of his observations, thousands of pictures of houses, of roads, of back alleys, a visual record of a man who looked at the world only to find the vulnerabilities within it. It was a terrifying glimpse into a fractured, predatory mind. The investigators pored over these files, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the monitor, each frame adding a layer of depth to the portrait of the monster they were about to confront. It wasn't just a case of murder, it was a window into a career of parasitic existence. The logistical planning for the extraction reached its final phase. They were working with the state police to coordinate a silent transport. There would be no sirens, no flashing lights, no public spectacle. This was a process of reclamation, a quiet taking back of a life that had been stolen. The detectives felt the weight of the years, the frustration of the false starts, and the long, agonizing nights of doubt. All of it was crystallizing into this single moment of decisive action. The transition from the frustration of the cold case to the momentum of the prosecution was almost jarring, a sudden shift from the stagnation of the basement files to the sharp, cutting edge of a legal confrontation. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on the night before the arrest, the town of Oakhaven seemed to sense the change in the air. The usual evening hush felt different, not empty or haunted, but anticipatory. The police station was bathed in the harsh, sterile light of late-night operations, a stark contrast to the quiet, rolling hills that had once held the secret of Sarah's fate. They were ready. The warrants were signed, the team was briefed, and the path to the suspect was clear. The cold case was finally reaching its expiration date. The silence was about to be broken, the secrets unearthed, and the long-held shadows finally forced into the blinding, unforgiving glare of the truth. It was the culmination of a decade of persistence, a testament to the belief that no matter how deep the burial, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, demanding to be seen. The nightmare was ending, but the story, the real, raw story, was only just beginning to be told. The pre-dawn light was thin, a ghostly gray mist clinging to the razor-wire fences of the Regional Correctional Facility. Inside the transport van, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the vehicle moving through the dark. Detective Miller sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind replaying the files, the dates, the forensic reports, and the faces of the people who had been left behind in the wake of the 2005 Oakhaven disappearance. This wasn't just a transport, it was the final movement in a long, agonizing symphony of investigation. The suspect, a man who had spent years crafting a facade of mundane, blue-collar insignificance, was currently strapped into a secure seat in the rear, unaware that the game was fundamentally over. The intelligence they had gathered, the digital triangulation of his phone pings, the match on the recovered DNA, and the chillingly detailed map of his transit routes, had created a trap from which there was no legal escape. As the convoy rolled onto the highway, the weight of the moment began to press down on the entire team. They were passing through the very corridors where the suspect had once operated, the same stretches of asphalt that had served as his hunting ground. For the investigators, this was a surreal inversion of power. For 10 years, the suspect had been the one in control, picking his targets, setting his timeline, and choosing his exit routes. Now he was the package, the cargo, the evidence moving toward a final, unavoidable reckoning. The detectives watched the landscape roll by, each mile marker a reminder of the time that had been lost, the years that had been stripped from a young woman's life, and the decade of haunting uncertainty that had defined the town of Oakhaven. The air inside the van was static, charged with a mixture of professional resolve and a deep, simmering anger that had been kept in check for thousands of days. They arrived at the precinct as the sun began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. The facility was locked down, security perimeters established with the precision of a high-security operation. This was the theater of justice, and every actor knew their role. As the suspect was escorted from the van, he looked up, his eyes meeting the cold, unblinking glare of the cameras and the stone-faced officers. He wasn't the monster they had imagined. He was shockingly ordinary, a man whose unremarkable features were the perfect camouflage for his predatory nature. He stood on the pavement for a brief second, the morning wind catching his hair, before being led into the bowels of the building. The interrogation suite was waiting, a small, windowless box that would become the crucible where the final secrets would be forced into the light. Inside the suite, the setup was deliberate. The walls were bare, the lighting was intentionally stark, and the atmosphere was designed to be suffocating. There would be no comfort, no distraction, no exit. Detective Miller entered alone, the weight of the 2005 case resting on his shoulders like a mountain. He sat across from the man who had turned a quiet librarian's life into a cold case, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the low, steady buzz of the air conditioner and the distant, muted sounds of the precinct coming to life. Miller looked at the suspect, really looked at him, and saw the flicker of realization in his eyes. The suspect knew. He knew that the threads had been pulled, that the forensic web had finally tightened, and that the long-running script of his secret life had been edited to an abrupt, ugly conclusion. "It's been a long road," Miller started, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't ask questions, he stated facts. He began to recount the timeline of the Oakhaven case, not as a narrative, but as a deposition of reality. He laid out the evidence, the DNA, the vehicle logs, the cellular history, the microscopic debris. Each detail was a hammer blow, a piece of reality that the suspect had tried to bury under years of anonymity. The suspect's composure, initially firm, began to crack at the edges. He fidgeted, his hands tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm against the metal table. He was a man who had relied on the distance of space and the passage of time to act as his shield, and now that shield was being dismantled, piece by piece, before his eyes. Miller leaned in, his shadow stretching across the table like a dark promise. He talked about the farmhouse, the coffee cup, the quiet, the emptiness that had followed. He spoke of the parents, of the community, of the haunting, persistent ache of a case that refused to die. The suspect tried to deflect, his voice low and defensive, spinning tales of his innocence, claiming he was just a traveler, a worker, a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Miller wasn't buying it. He tore through the defenses, using the forensic timeline to pin the suspect to the scene, to the victim, and to the crime. Every denial was met with a, "we know," followed by the cold, hard data. It was an interrogation of surgical efficiency, a dismantling of a decades-old deception. The suspect's breathing became shallow, his bravado leaking away until there was nothing left but the raw, terrified reality of a trapped man. He realized that the investigators didn't just have a theory, they had the complete, agonizing, and undeniable truth. The weight of his past, a decade of buried secrets, was now sitting on his chest, crushing him into the chair. As the interrogation wore on, the shift in the room was palpable. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The predator was now the prey, and the precinct was the cage. Every word Miller spoke was a tightening of the knot, a locking of the mechanism that would ensure the suspect never saw the outside of a cell again. The investigators outside the room watched on the monitors, their faces tight with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. They were witnessing the death of a mystery, the transformation of a cold case into a closed file. It was a cold, professional victory, yet beneath it, there was the searing, emotional reality of what it meant for the victim. Sarah was no longer a name on a file. She was the reason for this entire, massive, life-altering confrontation. And in that room, the truth was finally starting to scream, refusing to be contained by the lies that had kept it hidden for so long. The walls of the suite seemed to lean in, as if the very air was hungry for the confession that was now inevitable, the final piece of the puzzle that would complete the dark, tragic picture of the Oakhaven case. The air in the interrogation room had become thick, almost viscous, laden with the weight of 20 years of secrets finally forced to the surface. Detective Miller did not blink. He watched the suspect, a man whose entire identity was built on the foundation of a carefully maintained, hollow silence, begin to unravel. It was a slow, agonizing process, a peeling away of the calloused exterior that had protected him from the gaze of the law. The suspect's hands, once steady, were now trembling with a fine, rhythmic tremor, the telltale sign of a man whose world was no longer under his command. He kept glancing toward the heavy steel door, then back at the evidence files spread across the table like a roadmap of his own undoing. "You think you were smart," Miller whispered, his voice cutting through the hum of the ventilation like a scalpel. "You thought you could outrun the past. You thought that because you crossed state lines, because you changed your truck routes, because you stayed in the shadows, that the truth would just dissipate. You were wrong. In this building, on this day, the past doesn't just catch up, it arrives with a warrant." The suspect let out a sharp, jagged breath, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. He had spent a decade operating in the gaps of society, an invisible entity passing through towns and lives, leaving nothing but the wreckage of his desires. But the forensic science of 2026, the advanced, deep learning genetic matching, and the reconstructed digital metadata had turned his invisibility into a liability. Every step he had ever taken, every digital footprint he had assumed was erased, was now being mapped onto the Oakhaven timeline with terrifying, mathematical precision. Miller pushed a photo across the table, a crisp, high-resolution scan of the original crime scene, the farmhouse kitchen that had been the site of the 2005 tragedy. "Look at this," he commanded. The suspect refused, his gaze locked on the linoleum floor. Miller slammed his hand down on the metal table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. "Look at it. You took her life, you took her future, and you left her family to drown in the uncertainty for 10 years. You didn't just kill her, you poisoned the entire town with your secret. You think you're just a drifter, a guy who had a bad night? You're a monster who built a life on the graves of the innocent." The suspect's composure, the thin veneer of the mundane, finally shattered. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, part frustration, part terror, and he slumped back in his chair, his posture collapsing as if his spine had turned to dust. The confession didn't come in a torrent. It came in bursts, short, defensive sentences that he tried to frame as explanations rather than admissions. He talked about the loneliness of the road, the crushing boredom that he claimed fueled his impulses, and the way he had convinced himself that no one would notice if one person, one librarian in a quiet, overlooked town, went missing. It was a chilling testament to the banality of evil. He spoke of the Oakhaven house as if it were a memory from a dream, describing the layout of the kitchen with a level of detail that could only come from someone who had stood there, in the dark, watching the clock tick down. For the detectives listening through the glass, it was a moment of profound, sickening validation. The cold case was not just being solved, it was being dissected, its dark organs laid out under the harsh, unflinching light of the law. The suspect went on, his voice gaining a frantic, jagged rhythm as the dam of his conscience finally gave way to the overwhelming pressure of the evidence. He spoke of other nights, other locations, other towns, a terrifying, sprawling itinerary of violence that extended far beyond the borders of the Oakhaven investigation. The detectives exchanged grim looks. They had come here looking for the answer to one mystery, but they had uncovered a legacy of horror. It was a sprawling, multi-state trail of blood that had gone unnoticed because of the sheer distance between the events. The suspect, in his desperation to explain his life, was inadvertently drafting a map of his own descent into madness. He talked about the thrill, the cold, clinical rush of the act, and the way he had used his profession as a truck driver to ensure that he was never in the same place long enough for the police to connect the dots. "I was a ghost," he muttered, his eyes unfocused, staring into a past that he could no longer escape. "I made myself a ghost because I knew that if they saw me, if they really saw me, the life I'd built would burn to the ground." But the life he had built was a lie, a flimsy structure held together by the thread of his anonymity. And now, the scissors of the law had cut that thread. Miller leaned back, his own adrenaline beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed resolve. He watched the suspect, recording every word, every stutter, every shift in the man's demeanor. This wasn't just a confession. It was the final, devastating collapse of a predator who had spent half a lifetime believing he was the smartest person in the room. The room was silent again, save for the rhythmic clicking of the recorder. The suspect's head hung low, his shoulders hunched, his presence reduced to that of a broken, defeated man. The transformation was complete. The ghost of Oakhaven had been exorcised, not through a supernatural intervention, but through the patient, unrelenting grind of the investigators who had refused to let a cold case stay cold. The news of the arrest would soon hit the headlines, a shockwave that would ripple across the state, bringing a mix of relief, horror, and a final, long-awaited sense of closure to a town that had been waiting for this moment since the dawn of the millennium. The investigation had moved from the shadows of the unknown into the harsh, bright clarity of the courtroom, and for the first time in a decade, the nightmare was truly, irrevocably over. But even as the suspect began to weep, his tears were not for his victims. They were for the loss of his own freedom, the final, pathetic realization that the world he had manipulated for so long had finally reached out to drag him back into the light. The cold case was solved, but the weight of it would linger long after the prison doors slammed shut, a permanent mark on the history of Oakhaven and a stark reminder that even the deepest, darkest secrets have an expiration date. The confession, once a trickle of defensive justification, had transformed into a deluge of horrifying, clinical detail. Detective Miller sat immovable, his pen scratching against the notepad, capturing every inflection of the suspect's descent into the truth. The suspect, now stripped of his bravado and the thin, artificial skin of his everyday persona, began to detail the mechanics of the 2005 Oakhaven disappearance with a terrifying lack of remorse. It wasn't just about what he had done. It was about the cold, deliberate planning that had preceded it, the way he had scouted the farmhouse, the way he had studied the librarian's patterns, the way he had waited for the precise moment when the rain would mask his movements. He spoke as if he were recounting a business transaction, his voice devoid of emotion, a flat, monotone drone that served to heighten the visceral horror of his words. "I didn't choose the house at random," the suspect said, his eyes unfocused, staring at the scarred surface of the table. "I chose it because it was isolated. Because the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away and the woods provided a perfect veil. I spent 3 nights in the brush before I even approached the door. I wanted to know the rhythm of the house, when the lights went out, when the kitchen clock chimed, when she would be most vulnerable." His admission was a direct refutation of everything the investigators had previously assumed. They had thought this was a crime of opportunity, a random act of violence in a sleepy town, but the reality was far more disturbing. It was a calculated, predatory operation, executed with the patience of a hunter who didn't care how long it took to bag the prize. Miller leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly contrast to the suspect's hollow monotone. "And the coffee cup? The open door? That was your signature, wasn't it? You wanted us to know you had been there, even if you weren't ready to be caught." The suspect gave a faint, chilling smile, a movement of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "I wanted to be a mystery. I wanted to see if the police in a town that small could actually find a ghost. I left the door open just to watch the lights go on and off from the ridge. It was a game. A way to see if I could exist in plain sight and never be seen." The audacity of his words hit the room like a physical shock. He hadn't just committed a murder. He had turned the investigation itself into a spectator sport. For 10 years, he had been reading the local newspapers, following the reports of his own crime, and feeding on the frustration of the people tasked with finding him. The investigators behind the glass were silent, their hands white-knuckled as they gripped the edges of the console. They were hearing the truth behind a decade of failure. Every time they had come close to a breakthrough, every time they had felt the ground shift under their feet, the suspect had been watching, laughing, and retreating into the labyrinth of his own anonymity. The realization that they had been outmaneuvered by a man who treated their professional struggle as a distraction from his boredom was enough to make their blood boil. But Miller didn't flinch. He stayed locked on, drawing more details out of the suspect, turning the confession into a comprehensive record that would hold up under the most intense legal scrutiny. "The other locations," Miller pressed, ignoring the sickening adrenaline spiking in his own veins. "You mentioned the interstate. You mentioned the routes you took in 2007, 2011, 2015. How many others, Mark?" The suspect went silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the corner of the ceiling. The air in the room seemed to crystallize, the weight of the unanswered questions becoming a tangible force. He wasn't just talking about Oakhaven anymore. He was confessing to a legacy of violence that stretched across half the country. The detectives in the observation room scrambled to pull the files of unsolved disappearances in every state the suspect had driven through. The connections were beginning to flicker into existence, a horrifying constellation of crime that had been hidden by the lack of communication between local jurisdictions and the suspect's ability to remain untethered to any one place. It was a systematic dissection of a serial offender's life. The suspect described the tools he used, the way he cleaned his tracks, the way he managed to bypass forensic scrutiny by never lingering at a scene for more than a few hours. It was a masterclass in criminal evasion, a testament to the way that modern, mobile predators were able to hide in the cracks of an archaic, localized legal system. The detectives were no longer just solving a cold case. They were dismantling an entire career of predatory behavior. Every sentence the suspect uttered was another nail in the coffin of his freedom. He was detailing the why and the how, providing the prosecution with a roadmap to a conviction that would be inescapable. As the hours stretched into a grueling, late-night session, the exhaustion of the ordeal began to show. The suspect's voice grew hoarse, his movements sluggish, but the flow of information did not stop. He was trapped in the gravity of his own confession, unable to look away from the path he had walked. Miller, too, was reaching his limit, his eyes stinging from the bright, unforgiving light of the room, his mind reeling from the sheer scale of the horror he was cataloging. But he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that this was the moment that mattered. They were not just closing a file, they were providing answers to families who had been waiting for a decade, giving voice to victims who had been silenced by the highway. The atmosphere in the room shifted as the confession moved from the Oakhaven case to the broader implications of his actions. It was no longer just about Sarah, it was about the collective trauma he had inflicted on the world. The investigators were witnessing the transformation of a secret into a matter of public record, the metamorphosis of a cold case into a testament of justice. The suspect, now reduced to a husk of his former arrogance, began to recount the final details of the 2005 night, the last moments before he had disappeared back into the darkness. It was a sequence of events so mundane and yet so profoundly evil that it left the room in a state of stunned, heavy silence. The case was no longer cold. It was burning, vivid and undeniable, an open wound that was finally being treated with a cold, sterile antiseptic of the law. As the clock on the wall crept toward the early morning, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The suspect's final, damning admission of guilt for the one crime that had started it all. The mystery was effectively dead, replaced by the crushing weight of the truth. The interrogation room, now saturated with the weight of the suspect's admissions, felt less like a police suite and more like a tomb being exhumed. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the faces of those behind the observation glass, a silent audience to the dismantling of a monster. Detective Miller, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot, stared directly into the eyes of the man who had turned Oakhaven into a haunted relic of the past. The confession had moved from the abstract to the devastatingly specific. Every detail shared, the exact location of the discarded evidence, the specific path taken through the woods, the chillingly calculated timeline of the librarian's final hours, was a knife twisting into the heart of the mystery that had once seemed impenetrable. "You mentioned the woods," Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, measured tone, demanding the truth of the geography. "You said you didn't leave her in the farmhouse. You said you moved her. Where, Mark? Where did you take her?" The silence that followed was total, an absolute vacuum that seemed to swallow the hum of the building. The suspect, once a font of clinical, detached information, suddenly hesitated. For the first time, his gaze drifted away from Miller, darting toward the corner of the room, as if he were trying to recall a memory he had buried under years of mental static. He had been a man of momentum, always moving, always shifting, and for a decade, he had compartmentalized his actions, treating his victims as milestones in his own dark journey. "The creek," he finally murmured, the word barely audible. The drainage culvert by the old mill, about 2 miles east of the property. It was the only place that wasn't flooded from the rain that night. The detectives in the observation room didn't need to speak. The room erupted in a flurry of movement. A team was dispatched within seconds, sirens silenced, heading toward the location that had been hidden in plain sight for 10 long, agonizing years. The cold case was no longer a matter of theory. It was a matter of recovery. The shift in atmosphere was tectonic. The frustration of the past decade, the false leads, the dead-end interviews, the sleepless nights spent looking at the same grainy crime scene photos, was suddenly being replaced by the frantic, high-stakes energy of a recovery operation. As the suspect continued to speak, the narrative began to broaden, expanding beyond the borders of Oakhaven. He described the collection of items he had taken from his victims, trophies that he had stashed in a climate-controlled storage locker in a neighboring state, a trove of history that served as a physical record of his crimes. He was not just a drifter. He was a curator of his own cruelty. Every piece of jewelry, every ID card, every trinket was a story that had been stolen and hidden away. The realization was sickening. The investigators were not only solving one case, they were about to trigger a chain reaction that would likely impact dozens of cold case files across the entire region. The serial offender label was no longer an assumption. It was a confirmed, documented reality that would redefine the regional crime landscape for years to come. The suspect's confession had become a torrent, a purging of the secrets that had weighed on him, not out of remorse, but out of a sudden, desperate realization that the game was over. He spoke of the adrenaline, the way he had lived in the perpetual state of being the other, the man in the corner of the diner, the face in the rear-view mirror that nobody remembered. He had been a master of the mundane, a predator who thrived on the lack of attention he received from the world around him. But as he described the way he had been caught by his own vanity, the desire to keep a souvenir, the mistake of using a credit card to pay for gas near a scene, the small, seemingly insignificant errors in his routine, it became clear that even the most meticulous monster eventually falls prey to the weight of their own history. Outside, the search team at the old mill was beginning their excavation. The rain, which had defined the Oakhaven case for 20 years, had finally stopped, leaving the ground soft and malleable. The detectives were using ground-penetrating radar and forensic teams to methodically sift through the soil, a task made all the more poignant by the knowledge that they were potentially moments away from finding the final answer. The scene was lit by portable floodlights, the bright white beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating the mud and the debris of the forgotten landscape. It was a stark, clinical process, a slow, careful peeling away of the layers of time to reveal the truth that had been tucked away beneath the surface. Back in the interrogation suite, Miller watched the monitor, his phone buzzing with real-time updates from the field. He saw the shift in the team's posture, the way they huddled together as a team member signaled the discovery of something, a fragment of cloth, a buckle, a remnant of a life that had been abruptly halted. He didn't interrupt the suspect. He let him keep talking, letting the man unspool the entire, wretched tapestry of his crimes. The suspect was now talking about his fear, not the fear of the law, but the fear of the silence he was finally breaking. He had spent years in the noise of the highway, in the roar of his engine, in the constant movement of his life, but now he was forced into a stillness that he couldn't escape. The weight of the case, the sheer, crushing burden of the missing years, was being lifted from the community, but it was being replaced by the raw, unvarnished reality of the recovery. The family of the victim, who had been waiting for phone call for over a decade, were now being alerted. The process was delicate, a balancing act of information and preparation, as the investigators knew that the recovery of the victim's remains would change everything. The cold case was being laid to rest, but the grieving process, the real, emotional reckoning, was just beginning. And as the suspect sat there, a broken, defeated man, he finally stopped talking. He had nothing left to offer, no more secrets to hide, no more lies to spin. The room was deathly silent. The only sound the low, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, counting down the seconds to a new and final reality. The hunt was over, the prey was captured, and the secret that had haunted Oakhaven was finally being dragged out into the harsh, undeniable light of the truth. The discovery at the old mill had sent a shockwave through the investigation unit, a kinetic burst of activity that transformed the precinct from a silent room of interrogation into a hive of frantic, high-stakes coordination. Detective Miller stood by the glass, his eyes fixed on the live feed from the search site. The forensic team was moving with the careful, agonizing precision of surgeons, clearing away the sodden earth around the drainage culvert. Every movement was recorded, every artifact bagged, every layer of soil documented to ensure that the chain of evidence remained ironclad. They were recovering more than just remains. They were recovering the timeline of the 2005 Oakhaven disappearance, a physical record that had been held hostage by the terrain for over a decade. The suspect, meanwhile, sat in the interrogation suite with his head in his hands, his previous stream of confession now replaced by a chilling, dead-eyed silence. He knew what they were finding, and he knew that the recovery was the final nail in the coffin of his remaining legal defenses. Inside the interrogation room, Miller re-entered, the door clicking shut with a heavy, final sound. The suspect didn't look up. Miller didn't need him to. The confession had already provided the map. The evidence was now doing the rest of the work. "We have them," Miller said, his voice flat, devoid of the adrenaline that had fueled the earlier hours. "We're confirming the items found near the culvert now. The locket, the fabric, the personal effects. It's all there, exactly where you said it would be." The suspect's shoulders twitched, a faint, involuntary reaction to the finality of the statement. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The games, the mystery, the facade of the ghost who could never be caught, it was all gone, stripped away by the reality of the forensic team's excavation. The atmosphere in the precinct had shifted from the frantic energy of the hunt to the grim, structured procedure of a case that was moving toward prosecution. Investigators were already filing the paperwork, cross-referencing the suspect's statements with the crime scene reports from 2005. It was a methodical reconstruction, a way of proving that the man sitting in the room was not just a drifter, but a serial predator whose actions had been carefully and maliciously orchestrated. Every detail the suspect had provided was being converted into a legal instrument, a weapon to be used in the courtroom to ensure that he would never walk free again. The legal team was already preparing the initial filings, the air filled with the rapid-fire exchange of terminology and the sound of printers churning out documents that would finalize the transformation of a cold case into a clear, resolved, and indefensible conviction. As the sun began to climb higher, the news started to leak. It started as a whisper in the local press, a rumor that the Oakhaven case, the town's deepest, darkest scar, was finally being healed. Then, it became an official statement from the department. The effect on the community was immediate and visceral. People began to gather at the edge of the police perimeter, a somber, silent crowd watching as the investigators worked. For them, the recovery was not just a forensic operation, it was a profound, emotional closure to a decade of fear. The cold case had been the defining feature of their collective consciousness, a ghost that had lived in the back of their minds, and now it was being put to rest. The mood was not celebratory, it was too heavy for that. It was a sense of profound, exhausted relief, a collective exhale that had been held for nearly 20 years. Miller emerged from the station to address the press, his face a mask of professional, tempered resolve. He knew the words he spoke would be the final chapter of the Oakhaven story. For a decade, this town has lived with a void, he said, his voice steady and projecting across the sea of cameras and microphones. We have worked, we have hunted, and we have persisted. Today, the mystery of 2005 is no longer a mystery. We have found the truth, we have recovered the victim, and we have in custody the man responsible. The cold case is closed. The ripple effect of the announcement was instant. Reporters scrambled to their vans, the news spreading across the wires in a matter of minutes. The story of the Oakhaven ghost was being replaced by the story of the Oakhaven resolution, a narrative of justice, however belated, and the triumph of forensic persistence over the shadows of the past. Back in the interrogation suite, the suspect was being processed for transfer. He was a man hollowed out by the truth, his face an expressionless mask that hid the chaos of his inner collapse. He had spent his entire adult life running, only to be stopped by the very past he had tried so hard to outrun. As he was led toward the transport, he didn't look at the officers, he didn't look at the files, and he didn't look at the room that had become the site of his final undoing. He was just a man in a jumpsuit, a shell of the predatory identity he had crafted for himself. The detectives watched him go, not with joy, but with the quiet satisfaction of a job that had been performed to the absolute limit of their professional capability. They had lived with the case, slept with the case, and obsessed over the case, and now it was gone. The file was closed, the evidence was catalogued, and the nightmare was over. But as the transport bin pulled away, the silence that settled over the precinct felt different. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty, but the quiet of a long-awaited, hard-won peace. The case that had been called cold for so long had been brought back to life, examined, and finally, permanently, laid to rest. The transition from the high-stakes intensity of the arrest and confession to the administrative and emotional aftermath felt like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. Inside the Oakhaven Police Department, the air was still thick with the residue of the past 24 hours, but the feverish pace of the investigation had slowed to the steady, rhythmic grind of bureaucracy. Detectives, who had barely slept in days, moved through the halls like ghosts, their expressions a mixture of lingering shock and profound, hollowed-out exhaustion. The case closed stamp, applied to the heavy, dusty, manila folder that had lived on Miller's desk for an eternity, was not just a bureaucratic formality, it was a symbolic end to a decade of collective trauma. Yet, as the quiet of the morning set in, The reality of what had been uncovered began to settle over the town of Oakhaven like a persistent, chilling fog. For the investigative team, the focus now shifted to the daunting task of coordination. They weren't just processing one man. They were preparing a case that would involve multi-jurisdictional collaboration on a scale rarely seen in regional law enforcement. The suspect's confession had opened a door to a labyrinth of unsolved disappearances, and as the forensic evidence from the drainage culvert began to return from the lab, the reality of his predatory reach became undeniably clear. The investigators were no longer just focused on the 2005 Oakhaven case. They were now the architects of a massive, interstate prosecution. Phone calls were made to departments as far as 5 states away, the tone of the conversations oscillating between professional urgency and a dark, shared recognition of the gravity of the crimes they were now tasked with illuminating. Meanwhile, the town of Oakhaven was struggling to process the news. The victims' parents, who had endured the agonizing, decade-long silence of their daughter's absence, were finally receiving the formal notification of the forensic identification. There were no cameras allowed, no public spectacle, just a small group of officers and grief counselors approaching the house that had been a silent witness to a decade of heartbreak. The detective leading the mission felt the weight of the moment in his very bones. Delivering the news of a loved one's discovery is a task for which there is no training manual, no amount of experience that prepares you for the shattering of a family's final, flickering hope. As they stood on the doorstep, the familiar sight of the front porch, the weathered wood, and the quiet garden served as a stark reminder of the normalcy that had been stolen. The reveal was not a moment of closure. It was the beginning of an entirely different kind of suffering. The mystery of the what happened had been answered, but the why was a hollow, echoing void that no amount of legal justice could ever fill. When the detective finally stepped back out into the cool, morning air, he didn't look at his colleagues. He looked toward the horizon, his face tight with the unspent energy of the investigation. He had helped solve a cold case, yes, but in doing so, he had become the messenger of a truth that was infinitely heavier than the silence that preceded it. The town, too, was waking up to a reality where the ghost of Oakhaven was no longer a legend, but a named, flesh-and-blood man currently sitting in a holding cell. The fear that had once been amorphous, a haunting presence in the back of everyone's mind, was now crystallized into a concrete, terrifying reality. As the afternoon dragged on, the local press began to converge on the precinct, their satellite vans creating a mechanical barricade around the entrance. The news had exploded nationally. The story of the decade-old cold case resolved through a combination of cutting-edge genealogy and old-school detective work becoming a central fixture of the news cycle. Yet, behind the scenes, the investigators remained focused on the minutiae of the legal process. They were meticulously documenting the suspect's property, reviewing the cache of items recovered from the storage unit, and ensuring that every single piece of evidence was perfectly preserved. It was a tedious, painstaking endeavor, but it was essential. If they were to put this man away for the rest of his natural life, there could be no margin for error, no loopholes for his defense to exploit. The suspect himself was no longer the centerpiece of the drama. He had become a vessel for the law, a prisoner being shuffled through the gears of the system. He was held in a secure, isolated wing, his interactions limited to guards and legal counsel. The arrogance that had fueled his decades-long spree had been replaced by a vacant, shell-shocked detachment. He was a man who had lived his life as a predator, a creature of the highways, and now he was reduced to a number, a series of codes and status updates in a digital database. The irony was not lost on the officers who monitored him. The man who had spent his life avoiding the gaze of the world was now entirely defined by the gaze of the state. As the sun began to set on what had been the most pivotal day in the department's history, the team gathered in the briefing room. It wasn't a party. It was a gathering of those who had carried the weight of the case for so long. There was no alcohol, no laughter, just the low, muffled sound of their own exhaustion. Miller sat at the head of the table, his hand resting on the now-empty file that had dominated his life for 10 years. "We did what we set out to do," he said, his voice quiet, barely carrying across the room. "We found her. We found him. The case is closed." But let's not forget why we started. It was a reminder that behind every cold case, behind every folder, and every DNA match, there was a human life, a person whose story had been interrupted, a family whose world had been forever altered. The detectives nodded, the shared acknowledgement of their purpose serving as a final, grounding anchor. The cold case was no longer just an investigation. It was a testament to the fact that no matter how long the silence lasts, and no matter how deep the burial, the truth eventually demands its day in court. The legal machinery, once set in motion, moved with a grinding, inevitable force that transformed the raw, emotional urgency of the arrest into the dry, sterile language of a capital indictment. The Oak Haven precinct, previously the epicenter of a frantic, adrenaline-fueled manhunt, now functioned as a staging ground for the prosecution's sprawling narrative. Detective Miller found himself shifting from the role of hunter to that of a primary witness, his days consumed by depositions, the endless cross-referencing of trial exhibits, and the daunting task of preparing a comprehensive timeline that would stand up to the most aggressive defense tactics. The suspect, whose identity had been a blank slate for 20 years, was now being scrutinized by a team of high-profile public defenders, their focus not on the reality of his crimes, but on the potential for procedural error, the forensic chain of custody, the interrogation tactics, the validity of the genetic genealogy that had ultimately collapsed his world. The courtroom, when the preliminary hearings finally commenced, was an environment of suffocating tension. It was a space defined by the deliberate, precise navigation of protocol, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, visceral reality of the drainage culvert where the recovery had taken place. The victim's parents sat in the front row, their presence a haunting, silent indictment of the suspect's decade-long spree. They were a study in stoic endurance, their eyes fixed on the man who had stolen their daughter's future, while he, in turn, remained focused on his own counsel, his demeanor distant and entirely removed from the suffering he had inflicted. The gallery was packed with a mixture of local Oak Haven residents who had watched their town be transformed by the case, and reporters from across the nation, all drawn to the final, public autopsy of a case that had once been deemed unsolvable. As the prosecution began to outline its case, the sheer scale of the suspect's operations became public record for the first time. The DA, a seasoned veteran with a voice that commanded the room, detailed the suspect's life as a long-haul truck driver, illustrating how he had used the anonymity of the interstate system to build a mobile theater of violence. He presented the DNA evidence, not as a mere biological sample, but as a definitive, mathematical bridge between the suspect and the crime scene. Each piece of physical evidence, the recovered items from the storage locker, the GPS logs from the long-forgotten transit reports, the forensic analysis of the debris found in his former vehicle, was presented to weave a narrative of cold, calculated predation. The suspect was no longer a person. He was a problem to be solved, a dangerous variable that had finally been isolated and contained. Miller watched from the gallery, his mind tracing the evolution of the investigation from the first, frustrated days in the farmhouse to this final, public accounting. He remembered the nights spent in the precinct, the quiet, demoralizing weight of the unresolved file, and the persistent, nagging doubt that perhaps they would never reach this stage. Seeing the case presented in the structured, logical environment of a courtroom was surreal. It was the cold case, finally coming in from the dark, stripped of its mystery and exposed as a sequence of brutal, avoidable acts. The defense, as expected, leaned into the technicalities, attempting to paint the evidence as circumstantial or improperly obtained, a strategy that felt jarringly disconnected from the gravity of the crimes themselves. Throughout the hearings, the suspect maintained his detached, almost catatonic presence, a choice that served to distance him from the unfolding reality of his potential life sentence. It was a strategy of erasure, a final attempt to remain a ghost even as the world around him was actively painting him into a corner. But the evidence was relentless. The digital footprints, the records of his truck idling near the Oak Haven outskirts, the phone pings that matched the timeline of the 2005 disappearance, the transactional data that placed him in the area at the time of the crime, formed a cage of logic that no amount of legal maneuvering could break. The jury, a diverse assembly of individuals who had been sequestered from the intense public discourse surrounding the case, watched with a grave, focused intensity, their expressions shifting as the horrifying mosaic of the suspect's life was pieced together before them. The impact of these proceedings on the Oak Haven community was profound. The trial became a ritual of public catharsis, a space where the collective trauma of the town was finally being acknowledged and addressed. People who had lived with the constant, low-level hum of anxiety for years were now able to witness the dismantling of the threat that had caused it. It was a slow, deliberate process, but it was essential for the healing of the town's psyche. The testimony from expert witnesses, who explained the evolution of DNA forensics and the precision of the genetic matching, highlighted how the tools of the modern age had essentially reached back in time to drag the suspect into the present. The cold case wasn't just solved by police work, it was solved by the relentless progression of technology, a reminder that in the 21st century, the concept of a perfect crime is becoming increasingly obsolete. As the hearings moved toward their conclusion, the weight of the testimony seemed to permeate the very architecture of the courthouse. The defense's attempt to introduce doubt began to falter under the sheer weight of the forensic corroboration. The suspect's own admissions, captured in the recording of his interrogation, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument, providing the jury with a direct, unfiltered glimpse into the mind of the man they were judging. Miller, looking at the parents of the victim one last time before the court recessed for the day, saw a flicker of something in their expressions. Not joy, for there could be none, but a kind of exhausted, final permission to move forward. The trial was the crucible in which the past was being burned away, leaving only the cold, hard, and final truth. The mystery of the 2005 cold case was effectively dissolving, replaced by the impending, inevitable reality of a guilty verdict, and for the first time, the future of the town felt like a landscape where they could finally begin to look forward, rather than constantly over their shoulders, into the dark. The verdict was not a thunderclap. It was a quiet, suffocating finality that settled over the courtroom like a shroud of iron. As the foreman stood, the silence in the room was so absolute that the mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit sounded like a roar. "Guilty," he pronounced, and with that single word, the decade-long odyssey of the Oak Haven case collapsed in on itself, its dark energy finally neutralized by the unwavering weight of the law. The suspect, standing to receive the judgment, did not flinch. His face remained the same mask of hollow detachment he had worn for the entirety of the proceedings, a man who had spent his life hiding in plain sight and was now, in the final hour of his relevance, disappearing into the anonymity of a prison jumpsuit. He was led away, his footsteps echoing against the polished marble, a sound that marked the definitive end of the ghost of Oak Haven. For Detective Miller, sitting in the back row, the moment brought no surge of triumph. There was only a profound, hollowed-out stillness. He looked at the victim's parents, their hands locked together, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a 20-year wait for an answer that could never restore what had been taken. They were not smiling. They were simply, finally, able to breathe. The courtroom emptied in a chaotic flurry of reporters and legal teams, but for those who had lived with the case, the space felt suddenly vast and empty. The mystery that had fueled the department's sleepless nights, the ghost that had haunted the Oak Haven farmhouse, the cold case that had stood as a monument to their professional limitations, it was all gone, erased by the procedural rigor of the justice system. The sentencing hearing followed, a formality that codified the suspect's removal from society. The judge's voice was measured and cold, listing the life sentences for each charge, an accumulation of decades that rendered the suspect's past and his future irrelevant. He was officially a relic, a predator whose movements were now restricted to the sterile, concrete boundaries of a maximum security facility. As he was remanded into custody, Miller felt a strange, jarring sense of dissonance. He had spent years imagining this moment, crafting scenarios of confrontation and retribution, and yet, in the end, it was remarkably quiet. Justice, it seemed, was not a cinematic explosion. It was the slow, methodical grinding of a machine that never stopped, never hurried, and never forgot. In the weeks that followed, the town of Oakhaven began a strange, hesitant process of renewal. The farmhouse, which had been the site of so much speculation and dread, was eventually sold, its new owners moving in with a sense of optimism that the previous residents had been forced to abandon. The evidence boards in the precinct were taken down, the grainy photos and tangled timelines discarded, leaving behind bare, clean walls that felt almost unnervingly pristine. The investigators returned to their routine. The new cases, the petty crimes, the mundane rhythms of police work, but they were forever changed. They were the men and women who had caught the ghost, the team that had successfully navigated the labyrinth of a cold case that had almost broken them. They were the ones who knew that beneath the surface of every quiet town, there are secrets waiting for the right technology and the right persistence to bring them into the light. Miller sat in his office one evening, the sky outside shifting into the deep indigo of dusk. On his desk sat a single file, a blank, empty manila folder that had once held the Oakhaven case. It was a clean slate, a symbol of the end of the nightmare. He thought about the victim, about the way her life had been cut short, and about the fact that while they had brought the suspect to justice, they had not, and could not, undo the past. The cold case was solved, but the void remained, a permanent feature of the world they occupied. Yet there was a different kind of peace now. The uncertainty was gone. The question, what happened, no longer existed in the air of Oakhaven. The truth, however horrific, had provided a foundation upon which the community could finally stand. The final report was signed, sealed, and filed away into the digital archives of the State Justice Department. It would sit there, a massive, multi-volume record of an investigation that had utilized every tool of the modern age to correct the failures of the past. The suspect would spend the rest of his life in the silence of a cell, his name becoming a footnote in the history of regional crime. And for the people of Oakhaven, the name of the victim would remain, not as the centerpiece of a tragedy, but as a person whose memory was now shielded by the finality of the law. The town moved forward, the seasons changing, the leaves falling, and the rhythm of life returning to its natural, unhurried pace. The nightmare had been a terrifying detour, but the road had been reclaimed. As Miller stood up to turn off the lights, he took a final look at the quiet, darkened office. He was no longer the detective consumed by the mystery. He was just a man who had done his job. The case was cold no longer. It was buried, not in a drainage culvert or a shallow grave, but under the weight of an indisputable verdict. The silence of the night outside was no longer heavy or ominous. It was simply the sound of a world that had moved on. The story of the Oakhaven cold case was a testament to the fact that while time may blur the edges of the truth, it cannot erase it entirely. The truth, in its own time and through the persistence of those who refuse to let the shadows win, will always, eventually, come home. And with that thought, he closed the door, the click of the lock signaling the final, permanent end of a decade-long hunt. The case was closed, the hunt was over, and the truth had finally, at long last, claimed its victory. The aftermath of the Oakhaven case was not a singular event, but a slow, tectonic shifting of the community's collective consciousness. Long after the gavel had fallen and the suspect had been absorbed into the gray, concrete anonymity of the state's maximum security wing, the ripples of the resolution continued to spread, touching lives far beyond the immediate circle of the victim's family and the investigators who had broken the case. The town of Oakhaven, which had been defined for nearly 20 years by the shadow of a missing librarian, found itself navigating a new, unfamiliar terrain. They were a town that had finally been given permission to let go, yet many found that the act of release was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. For the investigative team, the professional transition was perhaps the most jarring. After spending a decade living in the high-frequency, adrenaline-charged orbit of the ghost of Oakhaven, they were now faced with the quiet reality of a normal, mundane workload. The precinct, once a theater of intense tactical planning and forensic discovery, returned to its standard rhythm of petty thefts, traffic disputes, and domestic disturbances. It felt, to many of them, like being pulled from a deep, hyper-focused trance and dropped into a world that had continued to rotate without their notice. Detective Miller, in particular, spent his evenings in his office, the stillness of the room now heavy with the absence of the case file that had once anchored his existence. He found himself walking through the town, not as a detective on the hunt, but as a citizen, witnessing the subtle ways the community had begun to reclaim its own story. The media's departure was perhaps the most significant turning point. When the satellite vans finally packed up and the national reporters dispersed, the silence that fell over Oakhaven was not the oppressive, haunting silence of the past, but the natural, quiet stillness of a town returning to itself. The local residents began to hold impromptu gatherings, not to discuss the case, but to reconnect with one another, a way of rebuilding the social fabric that had been strained by years of suspicion and fear. They organized a memorial in the town square, a small, intimate ceremony that focused entirely on the memory of the victim as a person, her passion for books, her quiet kindness, her role in the community, rather than as the central figure of a cold case. It was a reclaiming of humanity, a deliberate effort to strip away the true crime narrative that had been imposed upon them and to replace it with a genuine, communal act of remembrance. In the legal and forensic circles, the Oakhaven resolution became a case study of monumental significance. The methodology used to bridge the gap between the 2005 crime scene and the eventual apprehension of the suspect was analyzed in seminars, written up in journals, and taught as a masterclass in modern investigative perseverance. The case proved that no matter how much time had passed, the evidence, whether it was the microscopic debris left on a kitchen table or the subtle, digital footprints of a transient life, remained an indelible record of the truth. It reinforced the philosophy that the cold case label is not a synonym for an unsolvable crime, but merely a state of temporary stasis, waiting for the technology and the persistence to align. The investigators became pioneers, their story serving as a beacon of hope for thousands of other families across the country who were still waiting for the day their own mysteries would be solved. As the months turned into a year, the suspect's life behind bars became a story of complete, agonizing invisibility. He was a man who had spent his life avoiding the gaze of the world, and now he was entirely defined by the gaze of the institution. He became a fixture of the prison's daily routine, a name on a log, an inmate in a block, stripped of the agency and the power that he had once wielded over the lives of his victims. Occasionally, he would appear in the news, usually in minor reports about prison population shifts or illegal appeals, but the public interest had largely moved on. He had been relegated to the footnotes of criminal history, a predator whose legacy was not one of mystery or intrigue, but of cold, systematic, and ultimately pathetic destruction. The final, lasting impact of the case was felt in the way the townspeople interacted with one another. The suspicion that had been endemic to the community, the way people looked at strangers, the way they locked their doors, the way they whispered about their neighbors had largely dissipated. The revelation that the killer had been a transient, a man whose only connection to the town was a dark, opportunistic choice, was a profound relief. It allowed the residents to realize that their town had not been rotting from within, it had been victimized by an external force. This realization allowed for a genuine healing, a shedding of the internal paranoia that had, in many ways, been more damaging to the town's spirit than the crime itself. Miller eventually retired, the weight of his career leading him to a quiet life in the countryside, far from the echoes of the precinct and the ghosts of his files. Yet he never truly stopped thinking about Oakhaven. On the anniversary of the resolution, he would often find himself sitting on his porch, looking out at the rolling hills, his mind drifting back to the farmhouse, the rainy night in 2005, and the relentless, grinding struggle that had eventually brought the truth into the light. He knew that while the case was closed, the experience of having lived through it was a permanent part of his identity. He had been the man who had stayed, the man who had looked, and the man who had finally seen. The story of the Oakhaven cold case would eventually pass into the folklore of the region, a dark legend that would be told with a sense of distance and relief. It was a story that reminded everyone that even in the face of the most overwhelming odds, when the truth seems buried beneath a decade of decay and the silence of time, the persistence of the human spirit, fueled by the relentless application of science and the unyielding drive for justice, can uncover even the deepest secrets. The nightmare had been long and the cost had been high, but the lesson was enduring. The shadows may be long, and the nights may be cold, but they are never, ever permanent. The light of the truth, once sparked, will always burn through, demanding recognition, demanding resolution, and ultimately, demanding peace. The town of Oakhaven had learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, but it had emerged, battered and changed, into a future where the past no longer held the keys to their present. The case was not just solved, it had been transformed into a cornerstone of their resilience, a reminder that they were a town that had faced its worst nightmare, stared it down, and refused to be defined by it. And in that final, quiet realization, the story found its truest and most profound resolution. The conclusion of the Oakhaven case had been a singular, earth-shattering event, but as the calendar pages turned into the second and third year of the post-verdict era, the town experienced something entirely unexpected, a profound, existential recalibration. The resolution had not merely served as an end to a mystery, it had acted as a lens, focusing the attention of the state, and indeed, the broader legal community, on the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed a predator like the suspect to operate in the margins for so long. The Oakhaven effect, as it came to be known, triggered a legislative and procedural overhaul regarding interstate criminal tracking, effectively closing the very cracks in the justice system that the killer had exploited for nearly 2 decades. This was the quiet, invisible victory that followed the storm. The investigators who had once been singular figures chasing a ghost now found themselves at the forefront of a national movement, consulting on task forces designed to bridge the gap between fragmented law enforcement databases. The case had become a blueprint, a standard-bearer for how modern, cross-jurisdictional collaboration could dismantle the invisibility of serial offenders. Every time a new, breakthrough technology was implemented in the department, be it advanced biometric identification or the expansion of genetic genealogy integration, the spirit of the Oakhaven case was present. It had transformed from a local tragedy into a national benchmark for investigative excellence, ensuring that the victim's memory would be tied not just to her death, but to the thousands of lives that would be protected by the reforms she had inadvertently inspired. The victim's parents, in the quietude of their later years, found a different, more personal peace. They had established a foundation in their daughter's name, one that focused on supporting families of the missing, a resource that had been agonizingly absent during their own dark odyssey. The foundation became a beacon, a place where people who were trapped in the same limbo they had once endured could find guidance, psychological support, and the relentless, practical advocacy required to push back against the apathy of a system that often let cases go cold. They were the silent architects of a new kind of justice, one that prioritized the humanity of the victim over the cold, administrative speed of the courts. Their work was a living, breathing testament to the fact that while the suspect had attempted to erase their daughter's existence, he had instead ignited a flame that would light the way for countless others lost in the dark. For Detective Miller, retirement was not a retreat into obscurity, but a transformation into a mentor. He began to lecture at the police academy, his curriculum built entirely around the grueling, transformative lessons of the 2005 case. He taught a new generation of investigators the value of the unsolvable, the necessity of revisiting the dusty, forgotten files, the importance of questioning the prevailing narrative, and the fundamental belief that persistence is the most potent tool in a detective's arsenal. He spoke to them not of glory or the high adrenaline chase, but of the weight of the badge and the absolute obligation to the truth, no matter how much time had passed. He was the living embodiment of the case's legacy, a man who had stared into the abyss of the unknown and refused to blink until the light was brought back. The town of Oakhaven itself underwent a physical transformation. The farmhouse, once the epicenter of a localized horror, had been renovated, the dark history replaced by the vibrant, messy, beautiful life of a young family. The woods that had once seemed to hold the secrets of the killer were now reclaimed as a municipal park, a place of trails and sunshine where children played, their laughter echoing through the canopy that had once served as a veil for a predator. The town had not erased its history, but it had successfully integrated it, turning the site of a tragedy into a space of living, breathing continuity. It was a powerful, silent rebuttal to the shadow that had once threatened to consume them. They had shown that a community, when pushed to its absolute limit, can find the resilience to not only survive but to thrive. Even in the state prison, the final act of the Oakhaven story was being written in the quiet, mundane passages of time. The suspect, stripped of his ability to interact with the world he had once manipulated, became a ghost in the real sense, a man whose existence was marked only by the shifting of his cell block and the diminishing returns of his legal appeals. His story, once a source of terror, had been stripped of its mystique. He was no longer the ghost of Oakhaven, the elusive predator, or the mystery of the hour. He was just an old, broken man in a facility that had seen 1,000 like him. The world outside moved on, oblivious to his existence, his name fading from the public consciousness just as surely as he had once tried to fade from the crime scenes he left behind. In the end, the Oakhaven case taught the world that the cold case is never truly cold. It is merely waiting for the right moment, the right set of eyes, and the right degree of refusal to accept the darkness as final. The resolution proved that the past is never dead. It is, in fact, always present, exerting a quiet, persistent pressure until it is addressed. The investigators, the family, and the community had together rewritten the ending of a story that was meant to remain a permanent, open wound. They had shown that justice is not merely a legal outcome, but a profound, emotional act of reclamation. As the years continue to roll by, the story of Oakhaven stands as a monument to the endurance of the human spirit. It is a reminder that truth, no matter how heavily buried by the layers of time, is a living force that will always seek the light. It is a testament to the fact that while a single life can be stolen, the memory of that life and the demand for accountability can reach across the decades, across the boundaries of geography, and across the limitations of the law, to demand a reckoning. The case was closed, the hunt was finished, and the truth was found. But the legacy of that pursuit remains, a beacon for all who believe that no secret is too deep to be unearthed and no justice is too late to be served. The silence of the Oakhaven farmhouse had finally been replaced by the roar of a community that had reclaimed its own voice, and in that, the case found its final, eternal conclusion. The story of the Oakhaven cold case, while officially closed, had evolved into something far more complex than a mere resolved file in a police cabinet. It had become a permanent chapter in the architectural history of the town, a cautionary tale that the community passed down, not as a legend of ghosts, but as a testament to the fragility of peace and the absolute necessity of vigilance. Even years after the final verdict, the impact was still being felt in the quiet, unexpected corners of daily life. The department itself had fundamentally changed. The Oakhaven Standard was now the shorthand for their procedural approach, a rigorous, almost obsessive methodology that ensured no piece of evidence was ever discarded and no lead, no matter how faint, was ever truly abandoned. The digital archives that contain the entirety of the case, every transcript, every forensic analysis, every GPS coordinate of the suspect's movements, served as a modern library of the investigation. For new detectives, these files were not just historical records, they were a training manual. They studied the way the original team had navigated the initial failures, the way they had managed the emotional toll, and the way they had successfully transitioned from an analog, localized investigation to the digital age, multi-state manhunt that eventually secured the conviction. It was a culture of institutional memory that ensured the lessons of 2005 were never forgotten, turning the trauma of the past into a protective shield for the future. The victim's family, having moved through the fire of the trial and the recovery of their daughter, had found a quiet dignity in their advocacy. The foundation they had established had grown into a regional power, influencing policy and creating a support network that spanned multiple counties. They were often invited to speak at conferences, their presence a grounding influence in a world of high-level law enforcement strategies. They did not speak of the technicalities of the case. They spoke of the human necessity for truth. Their voice had become the conscience of the legal system in the area, a persistent reminder that the goal of every investigation is not just the closing of a case, but the restoration of truth for those who have been left in the dark. Detective Miller, now long retired, had found a sense of closure that was as profound as it was quiet. He spent his days in the woods he had once walked as a young officer, the environment now entirely disconnected from the memory of the search. He found that the act of walking, of being present in the world, had replaced the obsession that had once defined his career. He was no longer the detective. He was a man who understood the nature of secrets and the value of peace. He often thought about the evolution of the investigation, the way it had started as a solitary, desperate act of willpower and ended as a collective triumph of justice. It was a journey he was proud to have taken, even if he would never wish the pain of the experience on anyone else. The town itself had become a place of renewed focus. The municipal park, where the drainage culvert had once been a site of hidden horror, was now a vibrant, central hub of community life. People held picnics, played music, and raised their children in the very space that had once been the final resting place of a stolen life. The community had effectively performed a long, slow act of exorcism, reclaiming the land by filling it with the simple, joyful activities of everyday life. This was perhaps the most effective way they had found to move forward, by refusing to let the history of the site dictate its future. The land was no longer defined by the crime. It was defined by the community that had survived it. In the national context, the Oakhaven case continued to hold a unique place in the discourse on cold cases. Documentaries, podcasts, and academic papers had been produced, each attempting to capture the essence of the investigation, but none could quite convey the raw, grinding reality of those 10 years of silence. The story served as a powerful reminder that justice is not an automatic outcome. It is a resource that must be fought for with unrelenting, methodical, and often exhausting effort. It highlighted the essential role of the public in supporting law enforcement in their mission, demonstrating that when a community and its police force work in tandem, even the most deeply buried truths can be forced to the surface. The suspect, now living out his days in the sterility of the prison system, was becoming an artifact of his own design. His attempts to appeal, his requests for transfers, and his minor grievances were all handled with the same disinterested efficiency of the institution. He was a man without influence, a shadow of the predator who had once terrorized the highways. His life had become a closed loop, the exact opposite of the transient, mobile existence he had once cultivated. He was a prisoner in every sense, his past crimes the bars that defined the scope of his world. For him, there was no resolution, only the slow, inevitable progression toward a quiet, forgotten end. The final legacy of the Oakhaven cold case, however, was not the conviction of a monster, nor the solving of a mystery. It was the resilience of the human spirit. It was the way a family could take the worst possible trauma and turn it into a source of support for others. It was the way a town could endure the psychological weight of an unsolved crime and come out the other side more cohesive and more vigilant. It was the way a group of investigators could refuse to let a life be forgotten, working against the odds and the passage of time to ensure that justice was served. It was a story that proved that darkness, no matter how deep or how long it persists, is not the ultimate end of the human experience. As the years continue to move forward, the memory of 2005 will eventually blur, the details becoming more historical than personal. But the foundation of the town, the strength of the community, and the legacy of the search will remain. Oakhaven will always be a place that faced the impossible and, through sheer, unadulterated persistence, found the truth. It is a town that knows the value of the light because it spent so long living in the shadow. And as long as there are those who remember the lessons of the Oakhaven cold case, as long as there are those who continue to hold the line for the victims of the past, the truth will remain the guiding principle of the future. The silence has been broken, the mystery is no more, and the town is, finally and irrevocably, at peace. The hunt has reached its true conclusion, not in a courtroom or a prison cell, but in the heart of a community that has successfully and definitively reclaimed its life from the darkness. The journey of the Oakhaven case had reached its conclusion, not through a sudden, final act of vengeance, but through the cumulative effect of time, truth, and transformation. As the years stretched further from the night of the discovery, the town of Oakhaven began to exist in a state of grace, a quiet, resilient stability that served as the final chapter in a story that had once been dominated by fear. Looking back, the trajectory of the investigation and its subsequent resolution appeared almost inevitable, a testament to the idea that the truth possesses an inherent momentum that, once released, cannot be stopped. The precinct, now operating under a new generation of leadership, held the memory of the Oakhaven case as its central moral anchor. It was the definitive proof that no crime, no matter how obscured by time or how sophisticated the predator's methods, was beyond the reach of a persistent, dedicated investigation. The junior officers who walked the halls, who heard the stories of the long-haul manhunt, the genetic breakthroughs, and the grueling court battles, absorbed the ethos of the case as part of their professional identity. They learned that the badge they wore was not just a symbol of authority, but a commitment to the victims of the past, a promise that no matter how deep the silence, there would always be someone listening for the truth. In the farmhouse, now a home filled with the light and laughter of a growing family, the cycle of life had completely overwritten the traces of the tragedy. The woods, once perceived as a sinister boundary of the town, had been transformed into a place of recreation and peace. This physical reclaiming of the landscape was more than just a matter of real estate. It was a profound, symbolic act of communal healing. By turning the site of the darkness into a space of joy, the people of Oakhaven had stripped the past of its power to dictate their future. They had shown that the strongest response to a void, the void left by a missing loved one, is to fill that space with the vibrant, messy, and enduring presence of new life. The parents of the victim, having transitioned from their roles as grieving survivors to the founders of a nationally recognized support network, continued their work with a quiet, unwavering dedication. Their foundation had become a sanctuary for families across the nation, providing the emotional and procedural support that had been so cruelly missing during the first years of their own ordeal. They had turned their own personal catastrophe into a mechanism for public good, creating a legacy that would outlive them by decades. Their daughter, once the centerpiece of a cold case, was now the catalyst for a fundamental change in how the justice system treats the families of the missing. Even the memory of the suspect had undergone a final, quiet dissolution. He was no longer a figure of terror, nor a puzzle to be solved. He was merely an aging, invisible inmate, his name rarely spoken and his impact relegated to the records of the past. The public discourse had moved on, and the media, which had once been the vehicle for the mystery's obsession, had long since ceased its pursuit. The case had served its purpose as a cautionary tale, a lesson in the dangers of ignoring the margins of society and the vital importance of modern, collaborative law enforcement. As the seasons in Oakhaven continued to turn, the town settled into a rhythm that felt both ancient and new. It was a place where people lived, worked, and grew old, a place defined by its daily routines and its quiet, communal bonds. The history of the cold case remained, a dark, foundational stone upon which the current peace had been built, but it no longer weighed heavily on the town's spirit. It was remembered with a sense of perspective, a recognition of how far they had come and how much they had endured. The ultimate lesson of the Oakhaven case was not about the nature of evil, but about the resilience of the light. It was a story of how a single life, when pursued with honesty, persistence, and the tools of the modern age, could be brought home, even from the deepest corners of the unknown. The investigation had succeeded not because it was perfect, but because the people involved, the detectives, the family, the community, refused to accept the easy path of silence. They had chosen, again and again, to engage with the difficulty of the truth, and in doing so, they had fundamentally changed the outcome of the narrative. For Detective Miller, looking out over the landscape from the quiet of his retirement, the Oakhaven case was a testament to the idea that nothing is truly forgotten. Every act of violence leaves a mark, and every act of justice serves as a healing balm. He saw the town not as a place of tragedy, but as a place of triumph. He knew that the story of the librarian, the hunter, and the long-haul predator would eventually fade into the deeper layers of local history, but the impact of their shared journey would remain. The case was, in every sense of the word, complete. The silence that had once defined Oakhaven was now a peaceful, restorative quiet. It was the silence of a town that had finally finished its long, arduous work. The hunt was over, the mystery was solved, the guilty were punished, and the truth had been honored. The legacy of the Oakhaven cold case would stand as a permanent, immovable monument to the belief that the truth is the most powerful force in existence, and that as long as there are those who are willing to seek it, no one will ever be truly lost to the dark. The final chapter had been written, the book was closed, and the community, finally and forever, was whole again. In this absolute, final resolution, the spirit of the librarian lived on, not in the horror of her end, but in the enduring, unwavering peace of her town. The story of Oakhaven was not just a case study in justice, it was a profound, timeless meditation on the capacity of the human heart to recover, to rebuild, and to remember. With this final reflection, the record of the Oakhaven case reached its true and rightful end. The final resolution of the Oakhaven case had become, in the years that followed, a bedrock of the town's identity, a quiet, enduring foundation upon which the community built its future. As the investigation receded into the annals of history, the focus shifted from the spectacle of the hunt to the quiet, dignified process of communal integration. Oakhaven, once defined by a singular, lingering tragedy, had transformed into a place where the memory of the past served as a catalyst for a heightened sense of collective responsibility. The tragedy had been the catalyst for an awakening, a moment in time when the town looked at itself, at its vulnerabilities, and at its strengths, and decided that it would no longer be defined by the shadows of its past. The precinct's commitment to the Oakhaven standard had not waned. If anything, it had deepened, becoming the internalized culture of every officer who walked through the station doors. They treated every case, regardless of its scale or complexity, with the same methodical intensity that had been required to solve the 2005 disappearance. This was the true legacy of the investigation. It had professionalized the empathy of the department. They understood, on a visceral level, that behind every cold file was a family trapped in a frozen state of grief, and they operated with the singular, driving goal of providing the answers that could thaw that ice. The technology had advanced, the databases had expanded, and the tools of forensic science had become even more precise, yet the heart of the work remained unchanged. It was about the persistent, unyielding pursuit of the truth. The victims' parents, now in the twilight of their lives, had found a level of peace that once seemed impossible. Their foundation had grown into a national pillar of support, a sprawling network of advocacy that had fundamentally shifted how the justice system engaged with the families of the missing. They remained a constant, quiet presence in the community, their resilience serving as a living testament to the possibility of healing after devastation. They had not allowed their grief to calcify, they had allowed it to inform their advocacy, turning their personal loss into a force for systemic change. In doing so, they had ensured that their daughter's life would be remembered not for the way it was taken, but for the profound, lasting impact it had on the world she left behind. Even the landscape of Oakhaven reflected this transition. The woods that had once been a source of localized dread had become a sanctuary for the living, a place where the community gathered, where children played, and where the natural world reclaimed the sites of past horrors. The municipal park, designed with an eye toward communal connection, stood as a living, breathing rebuttal to the idea that a place can be permanently stained by the acts of a predator. By consistently filling these spaces with the mundane, joyful, and necessary activities of daily life, the community had systematically scrubbed the trauma from the land, leaving behind a place that belonged to them, not to the ghost of the crime. The suspect's existence in the state prison system had become a non-factor, a quiet, repetitive loop that no longer held any interest for the public. He had become the very thing he had once tried to avoid, an object of complete, state-controlled anonymity. His name, once a source of terror and curiosity, had faded into the background noise of the criminal justice system. There were no more headlines, no more investigative deep dives, and no more speculation about his motives or his reach. He was merely an entry in a database, a testament to the fact that the most heinous acts are ultimately consumed by the slow, grinding machinery of justice and the inevitable passage of time. Looking back, it was clear that the Oakhaven case had been a singular event that forced a necessary evolution. It had highlighted the dangerous disconnect that can exist between the vulnerable and the authorities, and it had proven that when that disconnect is bridged, when the intelligence of modern science meets the persistence of human determination, even the most insurmountable mysteries can be unraveled. The Oakhaven case was not just a crime story, it was a human story, a testament to the idea that no one is ever truly forgotten as long as there is someone left to speak their name and search for their truth. For Detective Miller, retirement was a time of reflection, a space to consider the long, winding road that had led to the resolution of the case. He often walked the trails of the new park, observing the life that had sprung up around the sites of his former investigations. He didn't see the past, he saw the future. He saw the resilience of the community, the success of the families, and the stability of the town that he had once been tasked with protecting. He had been a part of the darkness, yes, but he had also been a part of the light that brought the truth home. And in that, he found the ultimate satisfaction of a life's work. The story of the Oakhaven cold case was finally, irrevocably complete. It was a chronicle of survival, of the refusal to give up, and of the incredible strength found in the pursuit of justice. It served as a reminder that the world is a complex, often dangerous place, but it is also a place where the light of the truth can eventually pierce through the thickest, most enduring shadows. The case was closed, the hunt was over, and the town was, in the most profound way possible, at peace. The narrative had reached its final cadence, leaving behind a legacy of strength, of justice, and of the enduring power of the human spirit to reclaim its own story. The history of Oakhaven would always hold the memory of the tragedy, but the present would always hold the victory of the resolution. With this final reflection, the record of the Oakhaven case closed, leaving behind a town that had faced its worst nightmare and emerged into a brighter, more secure, and infinitely more hopeful dawn. The finality of the Oakhaven case had become so deeply woven into the fabric of the town that it was no longer spoken of as a case at all. It had transcended the bounds of a forensic report or a legal milestone to become part of the local ethos, a fundamental understanding that in Oakhaven, the truth was not an elective outcome, but an absolute necessity. As the years continued to stack upon one another, the town moved into a period of post-traumatic maturity, a phase where the scars of the past were no longer hidden, but accepted as integral parts of their collective identity. The department's internal culture had undergone a permanent shift, one that prioritizes the Oakhaven standard above all else. This standard, a rigorous, unflinching dedication to investigative persistence, was the bedrock of their training. New recruits were taught that the tools of the modern age, while powerful, were useless without the human element of intuition, the willingness to challenge established narratives, and the stamina to see a search through to its logical end. The files of the 2005 case were not kept in a deep storage warehouse, but were digitally indexed and accessible as a masterclass in investigative strategy. They served as a constant, quiet reminder that even when the trail goes cold, the truth remains static, waiting for the right set of eyes to find it. For the parents of the librarian, the journey had reached a place of profound, quiet equilibrium. Their foundation had evolved from a regional support network into a national force for policy reform, specifically targeting the gaps in interstate communication that allowed the predator to operate for so long. They were no longer the face of a grieving family. They were the architects of a safer future. They navigated their lives with a sense of mission, their daughter's memory acting as the steady, guiding light for their efforts. The grief had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into a constructive force, one that protected others from experiencing the same devastating isolation they had endured for so long. The town's landscape itself was perhaps the most telling indicator of the change. The land that had once been the site of the recovery, the drainage culvert that had lived in the nightmares of the residents, had been fully integrated into the municipal park. It was no longer a place of exclusion. It was a place of inclusion, where the town's residents gathered for festivals, morning runs, and the simple, quiet activities of daily life. The act of repurposing the site was a form of collective reclamation, a deliberate choice to ensure that the geography of the past could no longer serve as a container for fear. The park was filled with the sounds of the present, drowning out the silence of the past. The suspect, meanwhile, had faded into a state of total, bureaucratic insignificance. His life within the maximum security system was a series of monotonous, regulated events, entirely divorced from the world outside. He had lost his name, his agency, and his relevance. The Oakhaven case had essentially erased him, replacing his identity as a predator with his status as a permanent, forgotten fixture of the state's prison population. The world outside, which had once been held hostage by the fear of his actions, had completely moved on, leaving him to exist in the vacuum of his own making. Miller, in his retirement, often found himself reflecting on the nature of the cold case. He realized that the term was a misnomer. The case wasn't cold, it was merely obscured. The investigation was not about finding new facts, but about organizing the old ones until they revealed a pattern that was previously invisible. He realized that the success of the case wasn't due to a singular hero, but to the collective persistence of everyone involved. The detectives who held the line, the forensic scientists who pushed the limits of technology, and the community that refused to let the victim become a ghost. It was a triumph of the group, a testament to the idea that justice is a communal pursuit. Looking forward, Oakhaven stood as a model for how a community can survive the worst of circumstances. It was a place where the history of 2005 was acknowledged, not with shame, but with the quiet, dignified pride of a town that had navigated the darkest of passages and come out the other side. They were a community that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that peace is not the absence of tragedy, but the presence of the strength required to overcome it. The case was closed, the hunt was over, and the town was, in the most complete and irrevocable sense, at peace. The legacy of the librarian, her life, her contribution to the community, and the way her memory had galvanized a town into a state of heightened awareness, would continue to endure. The Oakhaven story served as a permanent, indelible record of what happens when a community refuses to let the shadows win. It reminded all who heard it that the past, while powerful, does not have to be the determinant of the future. The truth, in its own time and through the persistence of those who carry the light, will always, inevitably, come home. As the years passed, the specific details of the trial and the mechanics of the arrest would eventually blur into the background of local history, but the spirit of the Oakhaven case, the unwavering demand for truth, would remain. It was a story of resilience, of the human capacity to recover, and of the profound, transformative power of justice. The hunt, having traveled across decades and across the length of the country, had reached its final, eternal conclusion. The silence of the Oakhaven farmhouse had been replaced by the enduring, vibrant voice of a community that had successfully reclaimed its own life, its own narrative, and its own future. The story was told, the record was sealed, and in the quiet of the present, the truth sat undisturbed, finally, and forever at home. The culmination of the Oakhaven case had by now settled into the bedrock of local memory, a permanent, quiet fixture of the town's collective consciousness. As the years turned into a decade of post-resolution stability, the narrative of the librarian's disappearance and the subsequent forensic unraveling of the ghost of Oakhaven ceased to be a story of trauma. Instead, it had matured into a testament of civic endurance. For the citizens of Oakhaven, the resolution was no longer just a legal victory, it was a defining moment of communal reclamation, a realization that the sanctity of their town had been restored, not by accident, but by the deliberate, stubborn refusal of its people to let a mystery remain unresolved. The Oakhaven Police Department, long past the initial frenzy of the apprehension and the subsequent legal theater, had evolved into a sentinel of this new, post-tragedy era. The Oakhaven Standard, the rigorous investigative philosophy born from the ashes of the 2005 case, had become the department's institutional soul. Every new officer was walked through the digital archives, not merely as a matter of history, but as a rite of passage. They studied the maps, the GPS pings, the forensic breakthroughs, and, most importantly, the persistent, agonizingly slow process of human patience that had finally trapped a predator who believed he was untouchable. This wasn't just training, it was the passing of a torch. It reinforced the understanding that in Oakhaven, a missing person is not a statistic, and a cold case is not an abandoned dream. It is an open account waiting for the inevitable, eventual arrival of the truth. The victim's parents, having navigated the long, winding descent into grief and the steep, grueling climb to justice, had reached a summit of quiet, dignified impact. Their foundation, the Sarah Initiative, had expanded its footprint far beyond the borders of their county. It had become a sanctuary for families across the nation, those who, like them, had once been left to wander the wilderness of an unresolved disappearance. They provided more than just resources. They provided the living example that hope, when paired with relentless advocacy, is a potent, transformative force. They were the silent architects of a more responsive, compassionate justice system, ensuring that the legacy of their daughter was not the tragedy of her ending, but the resilience of the community she had helped to forge. In the physical landscape of Oakhaven, the transformation was equally profound. The woods, once perceived as a sprawling, shadowed boundary of the unknown, had been fully integrated into the life of the town. The municipal park, which contained the site of the original forensic recovery, had become a center of community vitality. On any given afternoon, one could find children playing on the grass, teenagers laughing near the trails, and neighbors walking their dogs through the very space that had once haunted the collective dreams of the town. This was the ultimate act of exorcism, the deliberate, consistent, and joyous overriding of a dark past with the simple, necessary evidence of a healthy, functioning future. The suspect, meanwhile, had long since vanished into the sterile, uniform obscurity of the prison system. To the world, he was a name in a sentencing document. To his fellow inmates, he was a nameless, aging figure in a gray block. To the guards, he was a code in a system of management. The predator who had once exploited the anonymity of the highways had been reduced to the most absolute form of anonymity imaginable. He was utterly, completely forgotten. The fear he once wielded had lost its edge. It had been dismantled, analyzed, and finally discarded. His existence was now a closed loop, a quiet, static reality that held no power over the town he had once tried to terrorize. Miller, in his retirement, had achieved a state of peace that felt hard-won and entirely earned. He spent his days in the hills that surrounded the town, watching the seasons change with a clarity that had been absent during his years as a lead detective. He understood that his contribution had not been the result of a single, brilliant revelation, but the product of 1,000 small, necessary choices. The decision to keep a folder open, the choice to question a witness for the 10th time, the insistence on pursuing a lead that everyone else had dismissed. He had learned that justice is not a destination, but a state of persistent movement, and that as long as the search continues, the truth is never truly out of reach. Looking ahead, Oakhaven stood as an enduring model of resilience. It was a place that had faced its worst nightmare and, through sheer, unadulterated persistence, had come out the other side. The story of 2005 had become a part of the local folklore, a dark, necessary tale told not to inspire fear, but to emphasize the power of the light. It reminded everyone that the world is indeed a dangerous place, but that the human spirit, when bolstered by the tools of science, the rigor of the law, and the strength of a united community, is more than capable of navigating the dark and finding the way home. The librarian's memory, once the source of a town's deepest sorrow, had become the source of its greatest strength. She was remembered not as a victim, but as a daughter of Oakhaven, her name now synonymous with the town's hard-won peace. The case was closed, the hunt was finished, and the truth was securely in hand. But the story would continue to resonate, a permanent, indelible record of what happens when a community refuses to let the shadows win. The Oakhaven saga had reached its final, eternal cadence, leaving behind a legacy of strength, of justice, and of the enduring, unbreakable power of the human spirit to reclaim its own story. The hunt was over, and the truth, at long last, was resting in the light, forever at home in the town that had fought so hard to bring it back. The final, lingering resonance of the Oakhaven case had, by now, transitioned into a state of quiet, historical equilibrium. The town had moved beyond the era of recovery and into a phase of permanent, structural resilience. Looking back from this vantage point, the narrative of the librarian's disappearance and the subsequent forensic unraveling of the ghost of Oakhaven was no longer just a chronicle of a cold case. It was a foundational text for the community, a document that defined who they were, what they had endured, and, most importantly, what they had chosen to become. The trauma had been the crucible, but the result was a town that possessed an almost supernatural level of cohesion, a collective vigilance that served as a silent, invisible barrier against the return of such darkness. The Oakhaven Police Department, long removed from the chaotic urgency of the initial breakthrough,